This session will begin shortly.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second day and the final session of the HRB's conference on trust and truth in health research. For anyone joining for the first time, my name is Maura Driscoll. I'm the CEO of the HRB, and I want to welcome you to the conference, which this year we're running in collaboration with Evidence Synthesis Ireland, Cochrane Ireland, and the HRB Trials Methodology Research Network. And for those of you who were with us yesterday, welcome back. Now, I'm going to make a few housekeeping announcements first. If you have any technical difficulties, it can happen. Live support is available and it's located on the top right-hand side of your browser. Very importantly, the live Q&A is available on the right-hand side of your screen, and questions can be submitted throughout the session. And that's important because at the end of the session, we're going to be having a live Q&A with the panel. So you can put in your questions anytime throughout the afternoon. There's a live speech to text available in the session information button, and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. We also just want to remind you that there are a number of exhibition stands in the exhibition hall, and that's on the right-hand side of the main timeline. The exhibition is open for live chats 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after the session. And outside of those hours, you can still browse through the brochures and watch the videos. And we'd really encourage you to network, if you can, with other attendees through the meeting hub. And that's also on the right-hand side of the main timeline. And finally, don't forget to download the conference mobile app to view the full agenda, speaker information, exhibitors, and there's also a lot more information as well. So moving on, I'm very pleased to introduce the Minister for Health in Ireland, Stephen Donnelly TD, who sent us this address to open the conference. If you were at the conference yesterday, you'll have heard this already, so you can feel free to just take a few minutes out. But for everybody else, here's a message from the Minister for Health.
It's a real pleasure to be here today for a conference that's focused on ways to build trust and truth in health research. Good health and healthcare depend on people making well-informed decisions. A part of this is giving people reliable information from a source they can trust. Over the past 2 decades, government investment and commitment to research has led to significant improvements in Ireland's health research system. Our plan for living with COVID-19 acknowledges the crucial role of research and innovation to inform and shape our public health and policy responses. COVID-19 has shown us all the critical role research plays in providing reliable information to inform policy. We're a small country, but our research contribution has been significant. Researchers here are leading and contributing to clinical trials and a wide range of other research and evidence to inform decision-making. Along with the pandemic, we've seen an infodemic. There's been an overload of information, a lot of which has been unreliable. We've seen examples of this in relation to the use of vaccines and on unproven medicines and treatments. This has exposed people and populations to the risk of using health interventions that are harmful or not using those known to be of benefit. So this conference comes at a crucial point in terms of dispelling myths and ensuring people know how to discern fact from fiction. I congratulate the Health Research Board and their partners, Evidence Synthesis Ireland, the HRB Trial Methodology Research Network, and Cochrane Ireland for bringing together more than 700 people over 2 days. The conference will raise awareness and understanding of misinformation and disinformation and its consequences. It will explore the solutions available to everyone for assessing the credibility of any health claim and to become aware of trusted sources. And finally, it will delve into the responsibilities on everyone to ensure integrity in reporting and sharing health claims. Involving public and patients as contributors and as decision makers is central to the success of ensuring information is clear, reliable, and understood. It's refreshing to see that we had their involvement in both the development of this programme and also within the programme itself. I'd like to thank Deirdre McLaughlin and Anne Daly for their invaluable contributions. We need informed decision makers and we need an informed public. To ensure people are informed, we must ensure we invest in research to generate reliable evidence and educate people so they know how to distinguish fact from fiction and challenge myths when they arise. I see this conference as a stepping stone in our journey to achieving this. I know the Health Research Board and its partners will continue to lead in the generation and promotion of understanding of reliable information in the healthcare sector. Thank you so much for all your work.
Well, thanks very much to Minister Donnelly for taking the time to prepare that address. I mean, we particularly appreciate it in the context of the COVID crisis and how busy everybody is in the Department of Health. And we appreciate his message of support for the conference and also his support for health research as well. Okay, so a reminder, I suppose, to everybody just at the outset that what we're aiming to do at the conference this year is to explore challenges and solutions in building trust and truth in health research. And over the 2 days, we've been looking at that from different perspectives. And I think what we can all agree on is that trust and truth and issues around that in health research have never been more important. And it's certainly something that many of us working in health research have been concerned with for some time. But I suppose this year in particular, we've had a crash course on the importance of good quality evidence and data to inform public policy, to inform healthcare decisions, and indeed to help inform our own responses and support us in making decisions about our own health. And I think we might all have noticed that it's been something of a live experiment. We've seen, firsthand the difference it makes when it comes to managing the COVID crisis, how much better that countries and health systems have done when they've had access to good, reliable and timely information. And where, as a result of that, policy decisions, healthcare decisions have been based on good evidence. But of course, when we talk about evidence and information, the whole basis for this is public trust. So we need to have trust in the quality of the data, trust that information is accurate, trust in the messengers, of course, and trust that where we don't know the answers as well, we're honest about that too, because I think that's really, really important. But in all walks of life, I suppose trust, as we know, has to be earned and we can't take it for granted. I wanted to just mention in the context of all that here in the HRB, we're putting the finishing touches to our next strategy. That's going to be published in the new year, and that's going to inform what we do over the next 5 years. And a big part of that is about being an independent, credible voice for research and evidence, and working hard to earn public trust. And another theme that's coming through is the importance of using and reusing health and social care data to inform decision making. And very importantly, the need for high standards in data management and governance so the public can have confidence in health research. So I suppose what all that means is it's not just about what we're going to do, but the way we work. And in particular, it means making a commitment to being inclusive and to strengthening our engagement with the wider community and putting the voice of people, public, patients and carers at the core of everything that we do. Now, yesterday we had 2 really good sessions. In the morning, the focus was on understanding health misinformation and disinformation. So it was all about how to recognise health claims, think critically. That was a theme that came up throughout the day, and make more informed decisions about health policy and practice and personal health choices. So first of all, we heard from Professor Ian Chalmers on the role of research ethics committees in protecting patients and the public and whether or not they can be trusted to do so. We also heard from Professor Declan Devan on strategies we can use to help us think critically about health claims. And then we heard from Dr. Gillian Murphy on how exposure to fake news can result in false memories and the possible consequences for behaviour. And then in the afternoon, in the second session, we looked at the concept of evidence-based medicine, how to assess the credibility of health claims, and the important role played by health practitioners and patients. So we had a great talk from Professor Edzard Ernst on the limitations of what he called SCAM, or so-called alternative medicines. And then we also listened to a really good conversation between Dr. Margaret McCartney and Deirdre McLaughlin on the very constructive contribution made by members of the public and patients to health research. And if you missed any of those talks, don't worry, because they're available on the conference platform if you want to catch up. So now in our session this afternoon, we're focusing on responsibility and integrity in reporting health research. So what we're going to do is we're going to address the role played by researchers, funders, policymakers, and the media in ensuring that research and outcomes are conducted, reported, and communicated in ways that are reliable and robust. So we have some great talks lined up, and we're going to follow up at the end with a Q&A session with the speakers. So at the risk of being repetitive, I'll remind you again to post any questions you have in the live Q&A section on the right-hand side of the screen. So let's get started with our first speaker. Dr. David Moher is a clinical epidemiologist from Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. He's also an associate professor at the School of Epidemiology and Public Health in the University of Ottawa, and his big interest is in helping to improve publication science. He's also originally, I understand, from Dublin, which is great, and a supporter of Ireland. So welcome, David, for that reason as well. And he's going to talk to us on promoting trustworthy research. Do we need to modify current perverse incentives and rewards when assessing researchers? So over to David.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this exciting meeting. I'm sad that I can't be there in person. Unfortunately, we need to get rid of this pestilent plague, and after that, hopefully we'll be all able to get together in Dublin and enjoy a nice Guinness, which I greatly miss. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about sort of incentives and rewards for assessing researchers in their career trajectory. I have a couple of disclosures. One is that I'm leading the Hong Kong Principles Initiative and also leading the Top for Academic Institutions group. And I will be mentioning both of those within my talk later on this afternoon. In academic world, those of you who are there will be very familiar with sort of how do we get from sort of a lecturer up to a full professor. What are the criteria that people use to enable the progression of a researcher's career? And we set out to look at this in 170 universities around the world. And we used a variety of methods to do that. And we looked at, we were interested in 12 criteria. 5 of the criteria were what we would call traditional, such as things like journal impact factor, the number of publications, and 7 of them were non-traditional activities such as publishing in open access journals and data sharing. And you can read the details in the paper that was recently published. And what I wanted to do, though, is share with you sort of 2 sets of results. Although we went to look at 170 institutions around the world, particularly faculties of medicine, we were really only able to look at about 100. And so that's a very important result, in that there are several universities where you simply cannot find what criteria universities are using, or faculties of medicine in this case, are using to promote and tenure their faculty members. But what we did find of those approximately 100 institutions we were able to look at is that the vast majority used very traditional criteria, regardless of the stage of the researcher's career. And very few of them used these, as I mentioned, these non-traditional criteria. So we really, most academics have heard of the publish or perish phenomenon, that really publications are the currency for research. And in academic settings, if you want to get ahead in many faculties, you need to publish, and you need to publish as much as you can, as quickly as you can. And university ranking schemes themselves are based on productivity. And what we see also is an increasing number of students require publications to complete their degrees. So, people have taken this to great lengths. Here's unfortunately a person who died, but on their tombstone, they've got a QR code that will take you directly to all of their publications. So, in some quarters, more seriously, people take publications incredibly seriously. And sadly, in other situations, here is a tweet that I found a little while ago. In the University of, in Cardiff University in Wales, a colleague committed suicide. In part, we know from this tremendous push to publish or perish. And the university's response to this was to simply make it more difficult to open windows. And in a sense, in my opinion, this is a sort of a very sad reflection on what appears to be all too prevalent in trying to move your career forward. If we look at the Lancet in 2014, they had a series on increasing value and reducing waste. And what they wanted, university teachers and a whole bunch of other stakeholders were to look at the data, so to speak, and examine more forensically whether they're sort of getting the bang for the dollar. So were universities getting the bang for the dollar by simply promoting this sort of behavior of publish or perish? And just to give you one example, if you looked at the quality of reporting, whether it was the abstract, the methods, the results, the discussion, or indeed the data, there were really quite fundamental problems with the research integrity, the research trustworthiness of certainly biomedical research. And there are many problems in biomedical publications. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we really see that there is significant problems around reproducibility, whether around the prevalence of spin, and really the endemic poor quality of reporting. And also, unfortunately, there's quite a rise in researchers publishing in what I would characterize as fake journals. And data sharing is uncommon. Even though data sharing is known to accelerate discovery, and I will come back to this theme on more than one occasion. So during COVID, the Wellcome Trust had an initiative which they produced very early in the year, and they wanted their researchers to share their data and their findings, the results. And the Wellcome Initiative was signed by literally, or not signed, but endorsed by hundreds of organizations. And specifically, the Wellcome Initiative stated in part that researchers, journals, and funders they needed to ensure that the research findings and data relevant to this outbreak were shared rapidly and openly to inform public health. Sadly, missing from this stakeholder groups were academic institutions, which are typically the home of researchers. And yet, if we look at the adherence to these initiatives, what we see, at least in sort of one example of over 500 COVID-19 papers in preprint servers, and only approximately 1 in 5 of them had any data availability statements, and even worse, only about 1 in 10 of them had any data availability. So despite the best intentions of this initiative and many others like it, it doesn't seem to be having an effect. And the question is, why? And sadly, we have some very strange literature coming to the COVID world. Here we have a mathematical solution to COVID. And it would be really wonderful if editors and peer reviewers knew what they were doing and actually were somewhat incentivized for what they're doing and incentivized for some form of training. And sadly, we've seen a number of increased retractions. There is a recent paper in the Journal of Medical Ethics, which gives somewhat of a deep dive into at least the first 33 major retractions. And again, why is this happening? And is it somewhat related to the perverse incentives and rewards that are in academic institutions? And I hope that these slides that I've been able to convince some of you, perhaps even only 10%, that the notion of the quantity of publications is perhaps not a particularly smart way to continue to assess researchers for promotion and tenure. And really this comes down to the notion of our researchers, our academic institutions, are they upholding research integrity? Because research integrity is really a fundamental part of that, is the notion of trustworthiness. And I hope that some of the slides you've seen here, me sharing with you this afternoon, would give you some cause for concern at the very least about the trustworthiness of this type of research. And so what I think, and a growing number of people think, is that academic institutions need to sort of move away from these perverse incentives and rewards, particularly the number of publications and journal impact factor, etc. And really they need to think about incentivizing researchers and rewarding them for trustworthy research. And I'm going to try to spend the rest of my time sharing with you some thoughts that some of us have. I do also want to make it very clear to you that we're not the first in this area, nor will we be the last, and some may argue we're not the most sensible. There's a lot of people who are in this space who are working together to try to make incentives and rewards more trustworthy as well. One of the early initiatives was the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, DORA, where they explicitly state that academic institutions should not use the journal impact factor to assess researchers for promotion and tenure and career projection. The goal of the Hong Kong principles was really to try to foster research integrity. As I said, research integrity is really very, very connected to trustworthiness, and to provide guidance for those completing research assessments to strengthen research integrity. And we concentrated on primarily on what research organizations could do, and really try to focus on implementation, because if you can't implement this, then it's very difficult to get people to change. So the Hong Kong Principles was published this summer, and I provided you with a URL. You can go and read more about it. It was developed in part of last year's World Congress in Research Integrity. There are 5 principles in this initiative, and I'm going to go through just a couple of them with you and give you some ideas about implementation, and perhaps it'll be useful for you in thinking about how you may take this back to your own institution to see whether there might be some interest in moving forward. So one of the principles of the Hong Kong Principles is to value accurate and transparent reporting of all research, regardless of the results. And we see that, for example, Wellcome have a journal, an open access journal, and they are very keen to publish results regardless of whether they're statistically positive or negative. And there are a number of journals that are also willing to do that as well. In terms of trying to help with accurate and transparent reporting, the Equator Network includes a library of over 400 reporting guidelines to help researchers ascertain which guidance will help them report their particular type of study. Everything on the Equator website is free, and we again would encourage people to use this, and we would encourage academic institutions to incentivize their constituents, their researchers, to think about looking at the Equator Network. We know that, for example, here is an example of a randomized trial showing that the use of reporting guidelines improves the completeness and transparency of reporting. And there are many other examples of this as well. So there are ways to incentivize researchers to more trustworthy research. And we also know that, what I want to do now is sort of change to another principle. This is another principle within the Hong Kong Principles. Value the practices of open science, such as open methods, materials, and data. And we know from this paper, as an example, Michel Mello and colleagues show that in general, that patients are keen for their data to be shared for research purposes. We also know that data sharing is associated with added value. Here's an example of randomized trials that shared their microarray data, were much more likely to have their research cited, which is an important way of disseminating research, is to ensure that it is being cited. Another example of valuing the practices of open science is something called data champions. So the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands, they sort of borrowed an idea from Cambridge University that sort of developed data champions. And Delft went one stage further, and they allowed data champions to use this information as part of their promotion and tenure. So what do data champions do? Well, a data champion would help researchers who are keen to share their data, but actually don't know how to do it, don't have the resources to do it, to make that happen in reality. So I think this is an innovative example of an implementation where a university have said, if you help your colleagues to enable data sharing, you can use this in your promotion portfolio. And recently, some colleagues published in Nature, sort of taking research integrity, the notion of trustworthiness, sort of taking it from the talk to the walk. So really taking it from, here's some ideas to how do we implement it. And there are some excellent examples in this paper of implementation, of strategies, as I've mentioned. And the Hong Kong Principles paper also has several examples of implementation as well. So what we want to try to do is really really promote university transparency. And a group of us are involved with the transparency and openness promotion for academic institutions. So just let me give you an example. If we can go down to the third row here, where it says data, materials, and code transparency. And a current institutional standard might be data sharing is not documented as an expected practice for, let's say, promotion and tenure. But a basic top adoption would be that it mentions that data, materials, or code sharing is a valuable contribution to scholarship and hiring, and will be considered in hiring, promotion, and tenure decisions. And then an advanced top for institutions for this particular item would be that the institution sets a minimum threshold for proportion of research data that actually needs to be shared. So I won't go through all of those examples, but here is just, we're sort of working up towards this. And what we hope to do is to go back, once these are developed, to go back and look at universities, including perhaps, let's say, Trinity College Dublin, University College Dublin, University College Galway, to see how do these universities fare in their openness for hiring, promotion, and tenure. And I think this will be, I think, something that universities might well look to. There is a similar initiative for journals that has worked extremely well. I'm going to end with just a few thoughts from the Chief Scientist of Australia, where he said, people respond to incentives, and a change will come only when grants and promotion are contingent upon best practice. And I hope that I've been able to convince a few of you, at least, that this best practice is really quite related to this notion of trustworthiness. We shouldn't really be interested in people simply publishing research that is not trustworthy. We should really encourage them to promote trustworthy research, and we should actually incentivize them and reward them for doing so. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, David, for that excellent overview of the issues, and you've raised a number of really important issues actually for funders, as you say, as well as universities. How do you assess research? How do you assess research applications and proposals? Avoid promoting perverse incentives, and also encouraging people to publish all the material that relates to the research. So we feel very conscious of that, certainly in the HRB, in terms of setting up our own open research publishing platform called HRB Open that supports publication of all data. And also, I suppose, in the work that we're doing around having proper data management plans. But we'll pick up on a few more, I hope, of these issues in the Q&A. Now, we're going to take a short break now until before our next session. And I think we are going to ask you to come back to us and rejoin us at 2:50. So not 3 o'clock as it says in the programme, but 2:50, so 10 to 3. So see you then. Welcome back, everyone. David Moher touched on the issue of research integrity in his presentation, and the next talk now is going to address that in a little bit more detail. So fortunately for us, we have our own local gurus in research integrity, because two of the people who have led the way in Ireland, and indeed in Europe, are Dr. Maura Hiney and Professor Anita Maguire. So Maura is currently head of post-award and evaluation at the HRB, and she's also currently the Royal Irish Academy nominee on the ALIA Working Group on Science and Ethics. And Maura chaired the group that revised the European Code of Conduct on Research Integrity, which was launched by Commissioner Modus in March 2017. And she's joined for her talk by Professor Anita Maguire, who is currently the Vice President for Research and Innovation at UCC, University College Cork. So Maura and Anita are going to talk to us about developing a culture of good research practice, national and international examples.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining Professor Anita Maguire from UCC and myself, Dr. Maura Hiney, from the Health Research Board for this session on developing a culture of good research practice. And we'd like to give you some national and international examples of how this is being done. But first of all, I would just like to stress what I believe to be good research practice, what that actually includes, what it looks like. So in my mind, at least, research integrity includes everything. It relates to the proposal, the preparation of it, getting ethics approval, design, making sure that it's well peer reviewed and so on and so forth. The actual doing of the research, so very much tied up with good research practice, with proper methodologies, clear performance, proper analysis and statistics and so on and so forth. And then the dissemination of the work at the end through either scientific publication or in public discourse. What are the threats to a good and positive research culture? Well, I mean, one of them is risk aversion, be that by funding agencies, the researchers themselves, or indeed their universities about perhaps blue skies research, or being seen to be wrong. There is also increasing evidence that increases in competition for fewer resources, be that research funding, places in universities, tenured positions, even research positions, is increasing all the time. And that, unfortunately, is only going to get worse in our current fiscal environment. There's also been increased metricization happening over the last number of years, both at the level of the funding agencies as they assess awards for approval and in the university system where they're looking at hiring and promotion. And this has engendered some very poor practices among researchers. And a lot of researchers also feel a huge sense of lack of job security, which doesn't help their behaviour at the end of the day. Another issue that some researchers have raised is the corporatisation of universities, where they perhaps don't feel valued in and of themselves within the university ecosystem, and that the universities have become a business. So there are a lot of EU projects being done at the moment through the Science With and For Society initiative. These cover 4 main areas. The first is around the development of guidelines and codes of conduct, and there are a number of projects in that area, some of them looking at disease-specific codes and others looking at how we might promote good practice and provide frameworks for people when they're working through guidelines and codes and their development. Another thing that the European Commission is very keen on is the creation of platforms so that there can be sharing of information across different projects, but also across stakeholder groups, be they researchers trying to develop training materials or policymakers looking for evidence. The third area of key importance for the European Union is training, and they are approaching this at many different levels, at the trainer side of things, also around institutional levels and drivers, and development of research training tools going right back to the secondary school and undergraduate students. And finally, they are very keen to encourage collaboration, and they have funded a number of different projects where they're networking networks, where they're trying to kind of ensure that there is global collaboration without, for example, ethics dumping, and where they're getting national groups together to learn from each other through mutual learning exercises. There have been 3 really interesting reports done in 2020 alone on research culture. Claire did a briefing paper on developing a research culture within its universities. The Wellcome Trust surveyed all of its researchers about how they think research culture will work, and the UK Research and Innovation Agency have also done a very interesting report. So what were the key findings from these reports? Because these really were coming from the researchers' perspective. Well, what they found was that if the researchers felt valued, if they felt secure in their jobs, if they felt supported by their PIs, by their mentors, by their departments, by their universities, and that they had a sense of autonomy, they were better able to withstand the slings and arrows of the challenges I talked about around competition and so on and so forth. Also, that local culture can really strongly influence behaviour, and that can actually override institutional and national policies. So that goes to show how important local culture is. And that the systematic pressures and perverse incentives that we see in the system are very deeply embedded. So that means basically that it's going to be very difficult to change, but that you can do this through a culture of continuous improvement and recognizing that nobody is alone in this, that everybody has a part to play in changing the system. So there's been a really interesting paper recently published through one of the EU projects, SOPs for RI, and they looked at 9 ways that you might be able to move from talking about research integrity to actually walking the walk of changing the culture. And they gave many different examples of how you might do this. One was through the creation of data champions, for example, at the University of Delft. A lot of universities were looking at better ways to assess researchers that is more oriented towards quality rather than quantity. Some universities, for example, the University of Glasgow, actually include collegiality as a criterion now for promotion to professorship. Most universities have introduced mandatory training of some sort at all levels. The University of Luxembourg, for example, has introduced research integrity coaches. And a lot of universities are now trying to get the researchers involved in developing institutional policies. And also there are some really good examples of recognising good practice in research integrity, in data management, and so on. So at this point, I'll hand you over to Professor Anita Maguire, who talks specifically about the Irish situation. Anita.
Thank you very much, Maura. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to give you some insight into initiatives which are being undertaken here in Ireland to support the development of a positive culture for research right across our research system. And I suppose central to this was the establishment of the Research Integrity National Forum in 2015. I've had the honour of chairing it since that time, together with my very able Deputy Chair, Dr. Jennifer Brennan from THEA. But I suppose the most important element of the Research Integrity National Forum is that it brings together all of the various elements in the research ecosystem. So the funders are there, the research performing organisations, and all of the other stakeholder organisations which form part of an ecosystem. So it's an ideal location to talk through and to share experiences as everybody is on the journey to ensure that they continue to develop the research and culture within their own organisation. And it's that shared participation which really makes a difference in the long term. I suppose many of the members of the forum have participated in international research integrity organisations. Maura has been the Vice Chair of NREO. Myself and Jennifer have both participated in the mutual learning exercise at European level, and we were also participants on the EUA working group on research ethics and integrity. So the forum provides a national centre point which can be seen as speaking for the Irish research system. And I suppose the role of the forum is that we were tasked with oversight of research integrity across the ecosystem, but specifically tasked with the actions which were embedded in the National Research Integrity, Research and Innovation Strategy. And we report annually to the Strategy Implementation Group. And the fact that our work was embedded in Innovation 2020 was very helpful to us in bringing forward the initiatives that we wanted to develop and ensuring the visibility of the work of the forum across the system. And I suppose in the first couple of years of the forum, we recognised that provision of training across the research system was a key priority. When you're trying to change the culture within a research performing system, that whole idea of training people and bringing them with you on the journey is a key element. Next slide there. So in terms of the training, we were absolutely adamant that we would have a minimum level of training available to everybody across the research system, whether they were in one of the larger RPOs or in a small RPO, that everybody had access to a basic minimum level training. And there was a tremendous partnership put in place, which was underwritten by the research funders with a contribution from the IUA and THEA. But together we developed a national shared service, which made the EpiGM training available across the system to all research performing agencies from January 2018 for 3 years. So we had access for 15,000 users over those 3-year periods, and by June of this year, over 11,000 researchers had accessed and undertaken the training, which is really a very significant input relative to the amount of training which was in place before the introduction of this system. And one of the most positive elements of this training scheme was that in addition to the early career researchers, the PhD students and the postdocs, there was a very high level of uptake among the PI community of this training. And I think that's a really important element of when you're trying to change the culture, making sure that the established researchers also participate and also understand what's the current best practice in terms of the conduct of research. So we had a remarkably successful rollout of this across the research system, and ensuring that that was available across all organisations, independent of the scale of that activity. Now, we all recognise that that basic online training, it provides a basic training, but it's not the beginning and the end of training people in terms of the good conduct of research. It's an essential foundation, but it's very important that each individual organisation builds on that in other ways, having direct contact, workshops and other engagements. And what I'd like to share with you is the thinking that we've had in University College Cork and how we've embedded this training as part of a larger system of altering the culture in the conduct of research in University College Cork. Next slide, please. I suppose it's very important to consider this from the researcher perspective. 99% of PIs want their research to be done to the very highest standards. People are committed to conducting their research to the highest standard possible. But we need to remember that for the PIs, there are so many demands on their time in terms of compliance and in terms of the various elements they have to manage to ensure their research is done effectively. There really is an onus on the research system and on the RPOs to ensure that we provide them with the tools and the supports they need, that as they're leading and mentoring their research team, that it's easy for them to build this whole idea of a culture of good conduct of research into their day-to-day lives. We need to work with them, we need to recognise the various demands that they are on, but our PIs have so many aspects that they need to keep in the air that even for those with the best of intentions, they need the support of the system to enable them to develop this. Next slide, please, Maura. And what we did in the university in UCC was we very much realised that, this is much more than a training process whereby you take an early career researcher, you put them through a training process, you tick the box, and suddenly everything is fine. Developing a good conduct of research is a much more nuanced and a much more long-term engagement with researchers. And we made sure that every step we took made it very clear to people that this isn't just something which you do when you tick a box and it's completed, that it really is about a journey, and it's about developing a local environment within the institutions so that the good conduct of research is the normal part of everyday life. We also recognise that while there needs to be a good culture at the RPO level, people's experience of their research life is actually totally dominated by the local environment within their research team or within their school or within their centre. So when you're working at an institution level, you need to filter it down and make sure that experience is actually lived by the individuals who work within individual research teams. And that communication down through organisations is much more difficult than it seems when you're talking about cultural issues. And we need to recognise that researchers' experience is dominated by the experience within their own team. At the outset of this journey, we used the Fulbright Exchange Programme to bring over Phil Deschamps and Bob Dooling from the University of Maryland, both of whom have a lot of experience in embedding a good culture of research within their university system. And they spent quite a bit of time here in Ireland. They travelled around to other institutions as well, and they were very open in sharing the journey that they'd taken along this journey. And that was very helpful to us in UCC as we formulated our thinking on how you best embed embed these principles within the day-to-day operation of the research community. Next slide, Maura. So what we did in UCC was we recognised that the Epigeum programme forms an excellent foundation, but in itself, it's a foundation that brings people a certain part of a journey, but you really need to enrich and embed that as part of a larger experience. And one of the things that we were particularly concerned about was that the experience of good conduct in research isn't about what early career researchers do, it's about what a whole research team does, right from the most senior PI who leads a research institute, the PIs within that research institute, the experienced postdoctoral researchers, the PhD students, and indeed the undergraduate students who may work in the research teams from time to time, and also the support research staff within those environments. So what we did was, instead of training these people separately, we developed a blended program where we brought all of the people in an institute together. So I brought my own team. I was there as the director of an institute, then all of the PIs on the team were there, the postdocs, the PhD students, and we spent 2 half days on workshops where we actually discussed really tricky issues, those grey areas that come up when you talk about what's right and what's wrong. We talked through all of those areas. And of course, what we were really doing there was giving the early career researchers the language, the knowing when something happened that they were uncomfortable, how do they articulate those concerns? And the fact that it was okay to talk about those with the senior management in the area. The shared experience spanning the whole range of career experience to us was a central element of this. And I think for many of the senior PIs who were present, they realized that while they might have felt they knew everything about this area, when it came to the details of talking about some of these difficult issues, they all still had something to learn in those areas. And then in addition, we had a workshop on data management, talking through how you manage your data, how you store your data, and we tailored that very much, depending on which research team we were going into, we tailored that story to match their own needs in terms of data management. And we had a workshop on reproducibility, again, tailoring that towards the needs of the individual group. And then at the end of that, the researchers were asked to feedback in terms of a reflective exercise. So they drew all of the strengths in the workshops on the conduct of the misconduct, the reproducible research and the data management, and they fed back a reflective exercise on those. And when they'd completed all of those, then they were awarded a digital badge, which they could use and which gives them a micro-credential showing that they've achieved a certain proficiency in this area. But for me, the really important element of this is that the whole group sits together and talks about these issues, so that the day something arises, the group is confident talking about these issues collectively. And I think that's the part which makes a difference in the long run. Go to the next slide, please, Maura. So we were delighted that this digital badge programme has been highlighted in a number of areas. So you can see here Epigeum highlighted the way in which we embedded their online training within this larger blended workshop programme method, and this is available online. It describes the philosophy of the course and also the way in which we implemented it. The next slide, Maura. And indeed, we were delighted that this digital badge programme was highlighted in the article that Maura mentioned earlier, where they called it out as an example of good practice in this area. Hi, Maura. I suppose finally what I would say is developing the research culture in an institution. This isn't something which happens overnight. This is a long, slow process which requires a lot of commitment from the senior leadership within organisations to ensure that time is carved out to deliver this. But it also requires partnership between the RPOs and also the funders and the policy stakeholders. Everybody needs to work together to ensure that the researchers prioritise this area and ensure that they align their efforts in terms of focusing on creating the appropriate culture for their research. In the long term, the time that we all take in creating this type of environment is well worth the effort invested, but this isn't something that can be done just on a very simple basis. Even with the digital badges that we have developed, it's a very, very good model, and we've probably trained, a couple of hundred people within UCC, but it only works when you have 30 or 40 people in a room. It's not something that you can scale easily, and it takes that time and effort. So I think it's important to remember, for quality change of this culture, this isn't something which can be done easily, but every step along the journey has a lasting impact, and I think that's worth remembering. Next slide, Maura. So finally, I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to share this with you. I'm very happy to discuss this further if anybody has any further questions. But hopefully the examples that Maura and I have shared with you will inspire you to consider how people can work together to ensure that we all deliver the best possible research culture across the ecosystem. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Maura and Anita. It's good to remind us that it's all about research culture and that everyone has a part to play in changing that. And certainly I know in Ireland, the Research Integrity Forum has been hugely important in driving change in the system here. So now for a different angle, I'm delighted to introduce Mark Little, who's going to deliver the keynote address this afternoon. Mark is a digital media entrepreneur, he's an author, and he's also a former journalist and broadcaster. So he's well placed to talk to us about how to deal with misinformation and alternative facts. I'm really looking forward to hearing his talk. So over to Mark.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure, great privilege to be joining you today. What I'd like to talk about for the next 25 minutes before we go back into Q&A is what I think is the World Health Organization has identified as the infodemic. And this is this parallel battle that we have as we see the spread and the second and third wave of the coronavirus, is to try and fight back against those who are spreading disinformation about the causes of the virus, about our reaction to the virus, and about the potential vaccinations for the virus. The people who are organizing campaigns of deception, which are counter to public health. So that infodemic, I think we can start thinking about strategies to flatten the curve of the virus, I think are very analogous to the kind of strategies we need to consider about how to flatten the curve of that infodemic. So what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily the detailed research or the suggestions. I know, for example, Eileen will talk to us a little later, has done some great research into this particular problem. I want to talk about my own personal story from about 10 years ago, working at the beginnings of what became the misinformation crisis, we wouldn't have called it that, up to the present time, where I'm now working on another project that is combating misinformation as it's manifesting itself right now. So what I want to talk about is thinking, and I'm just going to share my screen here with you and share some thoughts, which, as I say, are very much from the perspective of somebody that's been thinking about this problem for about a decade. How do we flatten that out of the curve of the infodemic? And so I want to step back before my first journeys into startup world. I want to go right back to the beginning of my career. So I became a journalist back in 1991, full-time at least. This was the first publicity shot for me when I joined RTE. And beside the fact that I haven't changed a bit, what I'm very much struck by is the change in technology around the distribution of information today compared to this time back 30 years ago. If you look there, for example, there's no sign of a mobile phone at all. We were disconnected from that. That terminal is a dumb terminal. There was no internet connected to that computer. And if you look behind me, those in that photograph, those tapes are all these sort of magnetic reel-to-reel tapes that we used to slice up with razor blades and put back together again to build radio programs, if you remember those, before there were podcasts. So it's just a reminder that in a single career, mine, there has been such a radical change in the way that we distribute information, and the volume of information, who distributes it, who's the gatekeeper. And I think that's at the heart of this question. So I went on from that humble beginning to live my dream. I was obviously Prime Time's anchor. I was the Washington correspondent, but it was really only when I was a foreign correspondent that I was at my happiest. And every foreign correspondent will tell you there's one place or one country or one topic gets under their skin. In my case, it was Iran. I found the nation, its history, its progress absolutely fascinating. This is me in the city of Isfahan in Iran back around 2008, I think. As you can see there, you know, making TV is like making sausages. It's something you don't want to see happening. And in my case, I think about that time, I was getting increasingly disillusioned about the fact that it took such an enormous effort to describe what was going on the ground in a place like Iran. About the same time, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube started to become more important in distributing information. And in 2009, I remember a light bulb moment for me where protests on the streets of Tehran against a contested election. In that case, very few foreign correspondents get into the country. I didn't. I relied upon what I could see on Twitter. And I started to understand that the balance of power had shifted from the correspondent, the gatekeeper, to young people like this woman who had a camera phone and a connection with a social network and were at the right place at the right time to describe history happening. That was that light bulb moment for me. First of all, it scared me and other journalists. We were no longer the center of the story, but it gave me inspiration. It made me feel like, what would happen if I set up a company in which it was a partnership between these authentic, real stories on the ground and old-fashioned journalism? And that became the start of Storyful. That was the first social media news agency. We set it up in 2010. We were lucky in that that year was the beginning of what we now know as the Arab Spring. And so Storyful was responsible for scouring the internet for these platforms like Twitter and YouTube and finding those amazing images or testimonies that would change the way we see history unfolding. In the early days, what struck us most, and I never forget seeing this photograph from Tahrir Square in Cairo, was the joy, the outpouring of this democratic spirit in the early days of social media, where dissident movements were using social media and in some ways sort of agencies like Storyful to get out the message of these decentralized grassroots networks of change. It still happens today. Social media is still a powerhouse in terms of promoting movements, decentralized movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter. So we saw that early promise. We were also seeing in places like Iran, groups like this Facebook group, Stealthy Freedom, which was a group of women protesting against the enforced hijab in Iran, using social media in a very joyous way to promote this democratic potential of action organized through social media. So I have to say, I still, and I was then, very much a believer in the democratic potential of this new media. At the same time, around the same time, we started to see the ugly side. We started to see the enemies of democracy realize that social media gave them a way to try dominate debate and suppress the democratic spirit of women like this. So we started to see, for example, social media used as war by other means. On the left-hand side here, you see the Israeli Defense Forces tweeting a warning to reporters not to go near any groups, the Hamas group. And then right after that, you see the armed wing of Hamas coming back and obviously criticizing and attacking the Israelis. So war was happening on social media. And then when we could see on the right-hand side, the horror of militant extremist groups realizing they could hijack the sort of discourse of social media, but also create sort of cinematic style terror. For example, the beheading of hostages, to try and dominate discourse and to try and use social media to essentially amplify not just the message, but this sense of terrorizing their opponents. So again, these anti-democratic forces could see in social media a way of fighting back against the democratic promise of those dissident movements. We also started to see another thing as well, which was organized groups that would fake information. For example, here on the left-hand side, there was a group that hacked the Associated Press account to say, I think this was back in 2012, that Barack Obama, the president at the time, had been injured in an explosion. And right below it in this graphic, you see that was the stock market spike downwards in response to that fake tweet. We started to see, for example, in the case of the crash of a civilian airliner, people coming online trying to promote the narrative that the plane had been shot down by some state actor and using false information to back up that claim. So we started to see the beginnings of disinformation. And I would categorize that as different to fake news or misinformation, as organized campaigns of deception with the intent of causing real world political outcomes. And I think that's the great problem that we were addressing back then. So clearly, I can talk about the theory of what we were seeing, but maybe I'll show you the practical example of what we were doing. We were using essentially investigative forensic science, almost like intelligence gathering, to try and establish the truth and context about major world events like this one, the Malaysian Airlines being downed over the Ukraine. We were also using new techniques, and I'll just show you a quick video to describe exactly what Storyful's technological advances were to try and back up this work.
We are part of a golden age of journalism and storytelling. Everybody now is a storyteller. There's hundreds of hours of YouTube video uploaded every single minute. when everybody's telling a story, which stories are worth listening to?
Storyful's first social media news agency in the world.
One of the big stories we've been covering today is Yemen. We found this pretty dramatic video. So what we want to do is go to Google Maps, establish the location. We find the building here, which matches exactly. And now we're going to attempt to get clearance for the content and provide it to our clients for use. Hi, my name is Joe Galvin. I'm a journalist with the news agency Storyful.com.
We've really prided ourselves in trying to build technology matched with expert journalism to basically mine the social web.
Anything that's happening in social media anywhere in the world, on any platform, we find it, we curate it, we post it.
Technology has really made our job different in that we can get the stories that are meaningful and truthful out there.
Google tools and services have been critical for us since the very beginning, from translation to 24-hour Google Hangouts. When human skill matches really cool technology, it's greater than the sum of the parts. And that's the reason why Storyful has had such traction.
It's about storytelling, being able to match that with technology to find the stories worth telling. How do we take the pulse of the internet to get to the truth and really contextualize it, editorialize it?
Defining the narrative, that's the search for truth. And that's what Storyful is doing, bringing an authenticity to storytelling.
I get up every day because I believe journalism plays an incredibly important role in the power of user-generated content.
It makes me feel empowered with social media.
And that's what I think has created the kind of disinformation environment we have now. People are overwhelmed, but they're also forced into a period where they're always emotional about the information that they're getting. Now, the reason that's so important is because, think back to it. These are two people that I read very extensively when I was younger. George Orwell, you will know, predicted Big Brother would tell us what to think. But interesting on the right-hand side is the figure of Aldous Huxley, wrote a book called Brave New World, who I think correctly predicted an environment where people were totally overwhelmed by things that made them feel good. And they became passive, and they became, in many ways, unable to sort out what was true from what was lie. And that's where we've got to. And so when you see Donald Trump in the early days of his presidency trying to sow distrust of the wider media, you saw the secret of a strategy that has been adopted by people like Trump and people like him in Russia, in Brazil, even in the Philippines. What they know is they only need to sow distrust of the media. They don't need to be believed themselves to achieve their ends. And this is what Steve Bannon, one of Trump's advisors, used to say. He used to have a phrase, pardon the French, flooding the zone with shit. What he meant by that was, as long as you can persuade everybody that everything should be distrusted, you will achieve your goals. Reducing the level of trust allows you to achieve your political objectives. And this is Jay Rosen, one of my most respected media critics, put it really beautifully in the last election when he said, when the people running the government are determined to lower trust in everything, there's no way of stopping them. And so that's what we've seen. We've seen disinformation from the top down as well as from the grassroots up. And that's the second wave, I would argue, of disinformation that we're now facing. Gone are the days when it was only elite groups or shadowy networks that could spread disinformation. In this second wave, what is critical is that those of us who believe in the health of information as being a critical component of a healthy democracy and a healthy society need to be thinking about how do we address this kind of new disinformation environment. And obviously the first thing we can do, and certainly I joined Twitter after I left Storyful, a great team. I was based here in Dublin, but I soon realized that the platforms themselves didn't have the answers. The technology companies weren't built to solve this problem. So myself and my former Storyful colleague, Anya Kerr, have joined together again, and we've set up another startup called Kinzen. So what Kinzen does is essentially try to take these advances in technology and help editors fight back against disinformation. So if you think about Storyful, we're the next generation. We're leaning into this technology advances in machine learning and AI to help editors scale the fight back against this second wave of disinformation. So what we do, for example, is we allow researchers and fact checkers and journalists to go in and search through YouTube and audio platforms using natural language processing. We
standard within journalism.
So clearly, I'm still very proud of the work that remarkable team did. We were a team of about 40 journalists when the company was bought by News Corporation at the end of 2013. It's gone on to become now a team of about 200 across the world. Many of the people who left Storyful have gone on to become incredibly pioneering journalists in places like the New York Times and CNN. But I think you can also hear then a certain sense of naivety about what would happen with social media in the years to come. So let's just think about Storyful being the first news agency of that first wave of disinformation. I think what we learned, and probably the biggest mistake if I was to own up to a personal failure in all of this, was to start thinking about the fight back against disinformation like a war. So we would describe this as like, we were fighting back against the people that were weaponizing social media, that it was us against them, and that eventually we would beat them. That wasn't the way to think about it, because a fundamental change had happened in the way that we distribute and consume information. And that was the thing we failed to understand in the early days, that really this was not about a war. This was a public health crisis, and it was a global health crisis, because we're sitting at the change in the way information is consumed as well as produced. And let's just think about that for a moment, because how people consume information, I think, is the critical point in the second wave of disinformation. It used to be that people would sit in front of the telly. This is back, let's say, in the 60s. And a couple of people on television, the gatekeepers, would tell them what was going on in the world that day. There was a scarcity of information. People were passive consumers. That was the old reality. And in the space of my career, there's this new reality where everybody can be a storyteller. Everybody has the means of production to get their story out there. And now we as consumers are faced with this tsunami of information every day that baffles us. And so that's a real problem. And Nate Silver, one of the preeminent pollsters in the US, has written a great book about this called The Signal and the Noise. And he's shown that every time we have a technological advance in how we consume information, like way back in Gutenberg's time, when the spread of information in Europe created violence, we now at this point where information growth has outpaced our ability to understand it, and that's causing major problems for the individual consumer. Added to that is the way that social platforms work. They don't rank information by quality, they rank it by how emotional it is. They want to develop in us a feeling of joy or a feeling of fear or a feeling of outrage. Anything to get us riled up, because that's the way they make money, through advertising. So all these new artificial intelligence systems, the recommendation systems, the algorithms, not only are they serving us up more information than ever, they are designed to make us feel some emotion. And that is a recipe for disaster. And that's what I think has created the kind of disinformation environment we have now. People are overwhelmed, but they're also forced into a period where they're always emotional about the information that they're getting. Now, the reason that's so important is because, think back to it. These are two people that I read very extensively when I was younger. George Orwell, you will know, predicted Big Brother would tell us what to think. But interesting on the right-hand side is the figure of Aldous Huxley, wrote a book called Brave New World, who I think correctly predicted an environment where people were totally overwhelmed by things that made them feel good. And they became passive, and they became, in many ways, unable to sort out what was true from what was lie. And that's where we've got to. And so when you see Donald Trump in the early days of his presidency trying to sow distrust of the wider media, you saw the secret of a strategy that has been adopted by people like Trump and people like him in Russia, in Brazil, even in the Philippines. What they know is they only need to sow distrust of the media. They don't need to be believed themselves to achieve their ends. And this is what Steve Bannon, one of Trump's advisors, used to say. He used to have a phrase, pardon the French, flooding the zone with shit. What he meant by that was, as long as you can persuade everybody that everything should be distrusted, you will achieve your goals. Reducing the level of trust allows you to achieve your political objectives. And this is Jay Rosen, one of my most respected media critics, put it really beautifully in the last election when he said, when the people running the government are determined to lower trust in everything, there's no way of stopping them. And so that's what we've seen. We've seen disinformation from the top down as well as from the grassroots up. And that's the second wave, I would argue, of disinformation that we're now facing. Gone are the days when it was only elite groups or shadowy networks that could spread disinformation. In this second wave, what is critical is that those of us who believe in the health of information as being a critical component of a healthy democracy and a healthy society need to be thinking about how do we address this kind of new disinformation environment. And obviously the first thing we can do, and certainly I joined Twitter after I left Storyful, a great team. I was based here in Dublin, but I soon realized that the platforms themselves didn't have the answers. The technology companies weren't built to solve this problem. So myself and my former Storyful colleague, Anya Kerr, have joined together again, and we've set up another startup called Kinzen. So what Kinzen does is essentially try to take these advances in technology and help editors fight back against disinformation. So if you think about Storyful, we're the next generation. We're leaning into this technology advances in machine learning and AI to help editors scale the fight back against this second wave of disinformation. So what we do, for example, is we allow researchers and fact checkers and journalists to go in and search through YouTube and audio platforms using natural language processing. We take out the particularly concerning words, the evolving language that defines disinformation campaigns, and help researchers start to tag it, understand it better. And from there, we can spot, for example, campaigns of deception that are being spread from the top down or from the bottom up by looking at the language they're using. We call these dog whistles, where we can start to see a narrative around a public health concern that's being used by these disinformation networks to try and win popular support. What we're also doing here is we're taking all the data from the fact checkers and from these researchers and these reporters and creating a sort of a Wikipedia style database that helps us build much higher quality machine learning models that can start to process the search for disinformation at scale. I don't want to bamboozle you with the technology behind it, but essentially what we're trying to do is help technology companies, news publishers, and others who are concerned about disinformation in society to try and scale the response to what is now such a vast problem. When we started Storyful, there were 25 hours of YouTube content loaded every minute. Today, there are 500 hours of YouTube content. We're trying to reduce the amount of content that we need to look at to solve the disinformation problem. But a couple of observations, because this fight goes way beyond companies like ours or even the technology companies. We are seeing successful experiments by technology companies to reduce the friction, i.e. to stop people from, reacting to the gut feeling they've got to share a piece of content on Twitter. We're starting to see people being reminded that this may actually be false information. So this friction is really important. We're also starting to see, I think, journalists cotton on to the fact that the old way of, writing sensational headlines about health information is the wrong way to proceed. And I'll give you an example. We've started to see in recent months a particular clip of a broadcast from a reputable news station in Florida talking about a mumps outbreak. And the first 10 seconds of this clip is being used by multiple agents of the anti-vaccination movement to suggest vaccines don't work. Just look at this, first 10 seconds and then the full report.
There is a mumps outbreak at the University of Florida, and now the school is desperately trying to stop this from spreading. 10 News reporter Liz Crawford talked with one student who got the mumps, and Liz, there are 24 cases of the mumps on campus. All 24 students were vaccinated. What gives?
Courtney, that's really the scary part. UF students are required to receive their MMR vaccine before they can attend school. That's pretty standard. Every one of these students were vaccinated, but still ended up with the mumps. Today, during a Facebook Live conversation I had on the 10 News Facebook page, that's what you wanted to know more about. How did vaccinated students end up with the mumps? Well, according to the CDC, 2 doses of the MMR vaccine are only 88% effective at preventing mumps. Mumps outbreaks can still occur and are more likely at universities and close-knit communities. That's why Kaylin Heron now wishes she had a 3rd vaccine.
So clearly there, the headline, the one that really does support the public health initiative, is the very last sentence. But that's not what got distributed. The anti-vaxxers out there took the first 10 seconds. the clickbait sensational lead in. And that's where obviously we have to be really conscious, not just for journalists, for any public communicator that's trying to express information about health, to be first, to lead with the statement that you want to promote, to pre-bunk people that might come along and cast doubt on public health information. So it's just a good example of how the internet now is full of people that are looking for ways to start informally sharing disinformation through influencer networks across the internet. Another good example is we've been watching this year a false narrative spreading that the spread of the 5G next generation wireless network is the cause of the COVID crisis. And look at this, for example, this is a track of all the conversations on Twitter about this false narrative from the very beginning of the year. What's really interesting is that in the end of the day, when you see the spike in about March 15th, that's from a singer online, an influencer, who just picks up this narrative and spreads it. We see a spike. And then about the beginning of April, an internationally known rapper comes out and says, oh, I've just heard this piece of information. And that's when we see the super spreader event. Again, very analogous to the virus itself. It's not a journalist and it's not a government and it's not Donald Trump that promote the spread of this virus. It's an influencer with a wide range of ordinary people who follow them that are the transmission mechanism in this case. We've got to start thinking about the virus of misinformation in the same way we think about the actual virus, that there will be these super spreaders. Our job is to get ahead of them. And I think that's another example we can look at is the spread of this seemingly innocuous 3 words on the internet in recent months: save the children. What it is actually one of those dog whistles. It is 3 words that have been hijacked by the QAnon movement, which has emerged from the United States. I won't even go into the kind of craziness of it. It's the accusation of a deep state conspiracy in the US. And to speed the international transmission of this particular conspiracy theory, they have hijacked this hashtag on social media platforms like Instagram, which ostensibly is about ending child trafficking. And what they've done is they've used these words and they've used the spread of misinformation through influencers. For example, wellness, yoga, new age spirituality has been a major super spreader community for QAnon and these 3 words, to the point where you're seeing things like ridiculous contradiction here. People who don't believe in the coronavirus spreading that message through masks. We're also seeing t-shirts on craft platforms like Etsy. Again, this is QAnon. This is a deeply political conspiracy theory spreading through what seems to be a very spiritual wellness type community. And the wellness community themselves, people who are the yoga instructors who've been hijacked by the conspirituality movement, or pastel, QAnon has been called, have been fighting back to disassociate themselves from their community becoming a host for dangerous misinformation. And I think that's what we've got to be thinking about more and more. It's not good enough just for the technology companies to act. They do need to act. It's not good enough just for journalism to be more responsible about the messages that they spread. We have to be thinking about misinformation and disinformation as something that is inside the brains of every individual, potentially. In the amygdala, our fight or flight mechanism, where we react to uncertain and insecure events with bias. We reach out for the information that feels true to us. And that's where we've got to be. In this second wave of disinformation and misinformation, we've got to work out strategies that make the individual citizen the real factor here. In similar ways that we've asked people to wear masks and wash their hands, we have to be thinking about this flattening the curve for this alternative pandemic through the eyes of the ordinary person. How can we help them? Now, as I say, there's other people that can, help us tease through some of the strategies. I think for me, it's summed up by this. We got to be out there. We got to be first. We got to be preempting events like the launch of a successful vaccine next year, by pre-bunking what we think might be the counterpoints, by filling the data voids out there with clear information. We can't assume that people will think rationally about something like getting their kids vaccinated. You have to inform them in clear, reasoned, evidence-based communication. So that's the second part. And finally, because this misinformation is spreading among friends and sometimes family, we've got to be respectful of why rational people might believe irrational things. We can't shame them into changing their behaviors. All the evidence suggests that's counterproductive. We have got to think about ourselves as being members of these communities of friends and family and communicate appropriately. Again, I'm going to stop there because I'm looking forward to our Q&A to discuss this. But I hope I've just given you 10 years of condensed experience from a first wave to a second wave of the spread of misinformation and how we might think about taking these high-level debates that used to be the preserve of journalism and technology platforms and thinking about how we can think about combating this information virus literally through grassroots movements that we lead. So that's my challenge, and hopefully we pick it up when we have some Q&A, but thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. That was an absolutely fantastic talk, and sorry to everybody for the technical glitch there. In the middle of it, there was a little bit of a jump in the slide, so we doubled back because we just didn't want to miss anything. But no, it's a really great talk, really interesting to hear about that, and I hadn't thought about this concept of a second wave and the whole idea of disinformation from the top down as well as the bottom up. But good to see the fight back happening and very practical tips for combating false narratives. So as you say, we'll pick up on quite a few of these points, I think, in the Q&A. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, we're going to take a short break, and if I could ask everybody to be back and to rejoin us at about 5 to 4, please. So 15:55. See you then. Welcome back, everybody. I just want to let you know as well that all of those fantastic illustrations that you're seeing during the breaks are available on the conference platform and also on the mobile app, so you can check them out. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker, and it's Dr. Eileen Culloty. Eileen is a postdoctoral researcher at Dublin City University Institute for Future Media and Journalism, where she leads research on countering disinformation, and she's doing that as part of a Horizon 2020 project. And specifically, Eileen's investigating how to use information supports to challenge false beliefs and dissuade people from sharing disinformation. So that's what she's going to talk to us about now. So over to you, Eileen.
Hello everyone, my name is Eileen Culloty from Dublin City University, and in this presentation I'm going to talk about the current scientific consensus on how to understand and counter online disinformation. And throughout we'll have a specific focus on COVID-19 and healthcare disinformation. So first I'll just give you a little background on some of the projects that I work on in and around the disinformation area. So Provenance is an EU-funded project where we're trying to develop new tools that would help people recognize and reject disinformation while they're browsing the web or social media. Voices for Vaccines is an outreach project funded by Science Foundation Ireland, where we're working with parents in parts of Dublin that have experienced a decline in vaccine uptake. And here we want to understand, what are the concerns those parents have about vaccines? Where are those concerns coming from? And do the current official sources of information reassure them sufficiently? And then finally, the mitigation project is part of DCU's response to COVID-19, where we're trying to understand what role citizens might play in countering disinformation. And the early results here suggest that citizen assembly type structures can be effective at reducing people's false beliefs. And I should also add that the COVID-19 project and Provenance are both directed by Jane Souter here in DCU. So I'll begin here with a story that's probably quite familiar to all of you, which is the distortion of scientific research. And Ben Goldacre has written about this for a number of years now, and this pattern whereby new research is published and then it's given this distorted coverage in the news media. Here I've gone with the Daily Mail, which is a repeat offender in this area, and on coffee, but there are many other examples, just wine, cheese, anything you can think of. So one news headline tells us that coffee can help fight cancer, and then another news headline will tell us that coffee causes cancer. Now, it's not surprising that this is extremely confusing for the public, these mixed messages that they receive. And in 2010, the World Cancer Research Fund did a survey in the UK, and almost half of respondents agreed with the statement that scientists are always changing their minds about cancer risks. And it's easy to see how they end up with this impression. And this impression that scientists are somehow very fickle in changing their mind is a real problem, because we know from research on climate change and disinformation that when the public perceive that there is a lack of scientific certainty, or that scientists have a lack of knowledge, then they're less likely to engage with an issue and they're less likely to act accordingly. So in the mass media age, this pattern of distortion was primarily the responsibility of news media. But in the digital age, there's now a huge array of sources where people can take up a piece of research and discuss it, and with varying degrees of seriousness. And along the way, the scientific research can be distorted, and it can also be used to push agendas. For example, the anti-vaccine movement is very developed online, and they will pounce on a new piece of research and twist it to push their own agenda. And then in direct response to that, there's been a growth of fact-checking organizations, and some that focus specifically on scientific fact checks. So we're stuck in this cycle of research, distortion, correction, and on it goes as each new study is proposed or is released. And of course, the problem with corrections is that while they have a very important role to play, there is no guarantee that it will reach all of the people who originally saw the false information. And here you can see an example of this during COVID-19. And COVID-19, of course, put this whole cycle into hyperdrive, because research work was greatly accelerated. The news media were very eager to publish the latest findings, even if those findings were only were not even peer-reviewed yet. And then many different people took them up to push their own agendas. So in this case, on the 8th of June, the WHO's head of emerging diseases made a poorly worded statement implying that asymptomatic spread is quite rare. That was then picked up by legitimate news media who were attributing this claim to the WHO, and then it was picked up by disinformation outlets like Natural News, who are now able to say that their source is a credible news source and the source for the news is the WHO. So they're adding layers of credibility to their own claims. Ultimately, of course, the WHO did correct and clarify their position, but at that point, Natural News, which is a very big disinformation outlet in terms of vaccine disinformation, were already able to push their own agenda. Now, in recent years, there's been a lot of research on what makes people susceptible to disinformation. What are the factors that render somebody more likely to believe or share or accept false claims? And I should stress that these are very broad factors. But one common finding across research is that cognitive capacity plays a role. So people who have low cognitive abilities or apply low levels of analytical thinking are far more likely to believe and share disinformation, and they're more likely to resist any efforts to correct it. And because cognitive capacity can decline somewhat as people age, this might be one reason why older people appear to be more susceptible to false claims. But there's a very strong situational dimension to all of this, because in any given scenario, even if we have very high cognitive capacity, we don't necessarily apply our full attention to processing new information. This is especially true on social media, where we're just scrolling through content. But it's also true when we're tired or stressed or have other things on our mind. And in those scenarios, regardless of your intellectual abilities, you are not paying full attention and you're more likely to take in and believe false claims. Motivated reasoning is very similar to confirmation bias. So it's the motivation to interpret claims in a particular way in terms of how they relate to your pre-existing beliefs, or to reject any information that goes against your beliefs. And this is closely related to knowledge and the idea that people can believe they're quite knowledgeable about a topic when they're not. If Fernbach et al. Did a study on people who are deeply opposed to gene therapies and genetically modified food, and they found that those people who had the strongest opposition believed they were very knowledgeable about the science behind them, but their scientific knowledge was actually very low. And this gave them a false confidence in their ability to analyze information about those two topics. Prior knowledge, it should be obvious enough that the more knowledgeable you are about a topic, the more likely you are to be able to spot when somebody is lying or presenting outrageous claims. And then when we think about science and healthcare, people's scientific literacy in general is quite low. So this creates an extra challenge. And repeated exposure is a really important point, and one that I'm going to come back to again later. And the essence of this is that the more often somebody is exposed to a false claim, the more likely they will start to think it's credible. So this is known in psychology as the illusory truth effect, and it's linked to memory. So the more often you hear a claim, it enters memory, and then you will recall it more easily. And what we can recall easily seems more credible. And this is important because it suggests two things. First, we must try and reduce the visibility of false claims overall. And second, when we're trying to correct disinformation, we must try and avoid repeating those false claims. And the final point is about literacy. So here I've called it information literacy, but it's obviously not limited to that. There's basic literacy, people's ability to read and write for themselves. There's digital literacy, their competencies with digital technologies, media literacy, understanding what sources are. And as I already mentioned, the scientific literacy, understanding how science works, what peer review even is. And so there's a huge range of factors that can come together to influence whether people are susceptible to disinformation or not. But these are just trends, and any scenario of disinformation is highly contextual. So for example, with COVID-19, some recent studies in the US have found that younger people are far more likely to believe false claims than older people. One explanation for this might be that younger people have a perception that they're less at risk, so they haven't been paying as much attention to news coverage as older people, so when they hear false claims, they're less able to reject them. Similarly, the COVID-19 in the US has become highly politicized along partisan lines. So Republicans are also far more likely to believe false claims and conspiracy theories about COVID-19 than Democrats. And this is a pattern with other scientific topics as well, in particular climate change. Once they become politicized, it becomes far less about the science than it does about people's political and partisan identity. And a related area has looked at vaccines. And again, younger people are far more likely to be hesitant towards vaccines or less certain about the relevance or significance of vaccines than older people. And then one explanation for this is that vaccines are a victim of their own success. So many generations have now grown up without a tangible awareness or fear of vaccine preventable diseases. And so in the previous slide, I was saying that older people appear to be more susceptible to disinformation, but what we see here in these specific contexts, that younger people are actually more susceptible. So what this underscores is that each case or topic of disinformation is highly contextual. There aren't any specific set of factors that render people susceptible in all scenarios. So a far less developed area of research looks at why do people share disinformation? Why are they posting it on social media? Why are they sending it to their peers? And what's interesting here is that people have a very broad range of motivations, and none of them, or they don't all necessarily mean that somebody actually believes the disinformation in the first place. So for example, somebody might find the pandemic video, the conspiracy theory video about COVID-19, they might find it absurdly entertaining, and they're sharing it because they want other people to see how absurd and stupid it is. Or they might share a story about anti-masks, and they might share that with their friends to express their own opinion or to find out what their friends think about it. And the reason I'm stressing this is that a lot of coverage of disinformation tends to focus on the volume of it or the amount of engagement it receives. So news reports will often say, the pandemic video was shared X many times, or it received X many likes on Twitter or Facebook. But that doesn't tell us anything about whether people actually believed it or gave it any credence. It just tells us that it was a popular piece of media. And the one motivation that I want to focus on in particular is this idea of warning others. So many audience studies have found that when people share disinformation, they're doing it out of a sense of civic duty. They find something that they think is alarming or scary. They don't know if it's true, but they want to let other people know about it in case it is true. And when you think about COVID-19 and all the rumors and just false information or false healthcare advice that went around, in the context of people being quite scared about themselves and their loved ones, it's really not surprising that they chose to share those rumors with other people just in case it is true. And there's something very positive in this, I think, because it suggests, well, first of all, that people's intentions are generally positive and they're pro-social. And that means that if we can find a way to reverse those instincts and to help people recognize that in a health crisis, it is vitally important that you only share reliable information, that that's the best way you behave socially and civically towards others, well, then maybe we could go some way to reducing the overall visibility of false claims. And here specifically, I'm talking about people whose intentions are good. Of course, there's another cohort of people who have already begun to believe in or fully endorse conspiracy theories, and that presents a very different scenario. But I would say that even amongst conspiracy theorists, research suggests that they are driven by a sense of civic duty and a desire to warn other people. So one way to look at this are that there are positive instincts that have gone awry, and instincts that we perhaps need to try and pull back and reverse. So thinking about the types of false information that we saw back in March and April when we were tracking this at the DCU Fujio Institute, it was a very diverse types of content. So we often use the term disinformation or fake news as these catch-all terms, but that misses an awful lot of the nuance. So back in March and April, a huge volume of content were just rumors. So rumors about new cases and rumors about health cures. And some of them were completely absurd. Some of them were plausible, but they appeared to be shared in good faith as rumors. We also saw a lot of hoaxes and scams. So hoaxes were often saying that there was some new policy measure about to be implemented. The scams were often impersonating public bodies like the HSE or the WHO and asking for people's bank details. Then, of course, there was this explosion in conspiracy theories. We know that whenever some big dramatic event happens, and COVID-19 definitely qualifies as a big dramatic event, some people demand or need an equally dramatic explanation for why is this happening. And claims that COVID-19 was a bioweapon or that it was being put out by or spread through the 5G network gave them that dramatic explanation. On top of that, at the geopolitical level, there was a lot of propaganda as various states were competing with each other to criticize the other and to promote their own actions. And then finally, there was just a huge volume of inaccurate opinion, or opinions with varying degrees of accuracy, I should say. So unsurprisingly, when this big crisis happens, many people start reading up about it, they become interested in it, and then they're commenting on what experts are saying, and they're giving their own interpretations and having their own discussions. You know, that in itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's this combination of all of these things together. So rumors that may have been with good intentions, inaccurate opinions, which people are perfectly entitled to, and then very deliberate scams, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories. That's what creates confusion. So when the WHO described an infodemic, this is the essence of what they meant. It's not just that there's lots of false information, it's that there's so much information that it's extremely difficult for an ordinary person to be able to spot the reliable information from the false information. So fortunately, there is some very promising results coming out of research on how to counter disinformation. And a number of studies now have found that corrections are effective. The big issue with corrections is how do you reach all of the people who were originally exposed to the false claim? But the corrections themselves are effective. In particular, if they come quite quickly after the people were exposed to a false claim, if they are repeated. So again, this idea of you need to repeat information. There's no point just putting out a correction once and then hoping people will remember. They need to hear it constantly. And also corrections need to have some content to them. It's not enough to simply say that information is wrong. It is more beneficial when people are given a reason for why that information is wrong and for why the alternative is the correct view. And the assumed mechanism here is that when people are given an explanation, they can actually update their knowledge and apply that in the future. We also know that corrections are effective when they affirm the strength of the scientific consensus, because a lot of disinformation or a lot of confusion is saying, oh, one person says this, another person says that, and that leaves people confused. Very similar to the example I showed you earlier of coffee causes cancer, coffee fights cancer. That just leaves people quite confused. So it's important with corrections or when trying to counter disinformation in general to affirm the strength of the scientific consensus. This is not just one or two people saying something. This is a consensus amongst experts. It's probably not surprising that the source of a correction is very important, and most studies find that people do trust experts. And they will pay more attention to a correction that comes from a trusted expert or some kind of authority, or something that is backed up and supported by evidence. Now, peers do play a role because it is usually through our peers that we get sent information and recommendations. But when peers themselves are citing or linking to expert sources, that's far more effective. And the final 2 points here are, I think, just very interesting work that has come out in the last 2 years and is now being affirmed through multiple studies, is that one very simple thing that can be done is just asking people to think about accuracy. You know, when people are responding to WhatsApp messages or browsing social media, you're encouraged to have these instant reactions and just hit like, hit share, or make a comment straight away. And that's part of the problem. We're not given time to stop and think for a moment. But what studies find is that if you just ask people, stop for one moment, does that even sound remotely plausible? Does it sound accurate? Where has it come from? Then their ability to judge information, to spot reliable information and reject false information increases enormously. And we're already seeing some social networks like Twitter begin to do this by putting in some friction or prompts. So if someone tries to share a link that they haven't opened, it will ask them, you know, do you really want to share this link? These are really simple ways forward to get people to apply more critical thinking to the content they're looking at. And then the final point is about pre-bunking, or what's sometimes called inoculation. And the idea here is that if you explain to people how manipulation works, how bad actors are trying to deceive you, they're trying to deceive you by making you scared or angry, or they're trying to create the impression that there is a lot of scientific confusion, when in fact the scientific consensus is really clear. Then people know to look out for that in the future. So a standard correction is really just a response to a piece of disinformation. But these pre-bunking or inoculation strategies are about giving people the skills and ability to reject disinformation about all kinds of topics. So finally, I just want to focus on this idea of correction. And what you see here is an example on the left of a Facebook post that took a new study that came out, and it distorted that study to say that asymptomatic spread is not a problem. And the agenda behind this was to say that there was no need for lockdowns and public health measures were all overblown. In response to this post getting lots of traction online, the health feedback website published a debunk. And I'm going to walk you through this debunk here so you can see how they put it together. So in the headline, it tells us that a Facebook post misinterpreted a study of contacts to claim that asymptomatic spread does not occur. Then it gives us some more detail about the claim itself. Asymptomatic carriers cannot spread COVID-19. COVID-19 is not contagious. Masks are not needed, and so on. And then it tells us that this is a flawed reasoning. Underneath that, then, it's going to provide a bit more explanation about this, why it's wrong, because it fails to grasp the significance of observation. And then it tells us the key takeaway. And then it goes further into repeating what the problems is, asymptomatic carriers, and so on. The review is then quite lengthy. It's got lots of links and lots of resources, and it goes into great detail about the specific claims and why they are wrong. And then there's a nice list of references at the end. Now, you might have gathered from listening to me describe this, what the problem is here. In the headline on the front top of the page, so the first thing somebody is going to see, you're just seeing false information repeated again and again and again. So if somebody comes or is sent this link because they believe the false claim, and they're sent this link and they browse it really quickly, all they see is actually an affirmation of the false claims. So as I mentioned earlier, this repeated exposure is a big problem. And then when the debunk tries to explain why all of this is wrong, it's just a massive block of text. And there's a lot of great detail there, and it's very diligently linked, and there are references at the end, but you're asking a person to go through an awful lot of effort because the truth is buried in all of that detail at the bottom. And if you think about the original false claim, it was a really simple Facebook post with big block text spreading false information. And then the response here, the truth is buried underneath the false information, and it requires an awful lot of effort for somebody to get through it. So the key takeaway then, and I think this is true whether you are delivering a big correction, like in the previous example, whether it's in an interview or whether it's just talking to somebody, is to always reinforce correct information. Verification practitioners have this phrase about the truth sandwich, that you lead with correct information, maybe you mention the false claim, but then you come back and reinforce correct information. It's often necessary to engage and to go into detail about why something is wrong or what the nature of the false claim is, but that should not be prioritized. You always want people to come away clearly understanding what is the reliable information. And then related to that, a correction has to be accessible. There is no point providing a mini treatise explaining the nature of scientific observation if people can't understand that, or they haven't got the background knowledge or skills to even understand what that means. And the disinformation actors are making their claims as accessible as possible. They're in shiny videos, they're in simple memes, they're done as jokes. So it's highly accessible. And also, if we know that people who have lower cognitive ability are at risk of disinformation, well, then there's little point in making big blocks of text available to explain it to them when they may lack the literacy capabilities or even the digital skills to go and find it in the first place. And that's not to say that detailed information shouldn't be provided. Of course it should, but it shouldn't only be the detailed information. It also has to be done in a very accessible way. So that is the end of the presentation, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thanks very much, Eileen. That was brilliant. I mean, you raised some really interesting points there about motivations for sharing and the importance of understanding those motivations if we want to come up with strategies to counter false claims and what might be effective responses to those kind of claims. Okay, we've heard great talks this afternoon, 4 fantastic talks, and I gather there's been huge interest, lots of really good questions coming through. So we're going to invite all the speakers back now to join us for the panel discussion. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Claire O Connell, journalist and broadcaster, who's our moderator for this session. I think Claire has been going through the questions as they come in. So Claire, I'm handing over to you now to guide us through the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mairead. And thank you to all our wonderful speakers today. I have to say I was absolutely glued to everybody, and wonderful to see all the questions coming in as well. We will try to get through as many as we can, but we are limited in time. So let's crack on. Yes, it is. I think as has been mentioned quite a few times in this conference, it is a time of huge opportunity for building trust and truth in health research, but it's a time of vulnerability as well. There's a fragility there, and for many of the reasons that we've talked about this afternoon as well. So I might start with you, David. I suppose going back to your talk, you mentioned there, you're a clinical epidemiologist, you're very interested in the quality of publications coming out. You mentioned fake journals. I'm intrigued to know what you consider a fake journal so we can know what to look out for.
Right, so fake journals for me are predatory journals by and large, and there's a very large number of them, depending on who you look at in terms of research, anywhere from 400,000 to 500,000 articles a year. And we recently sort of published a consensus definition of a predatory journal, but we really don't know whether what they publish is real or fake.
Okay, but it's definitely something that researchers need to look out for then, I suppose, if they're thinking of publishing in one of those journals.
I think they do, because they permeated trusted sources such as Biomed Central, Scopus. I could give you lots of data, but in a sense, it might be meaningless. The overriding comment is that they have permeated these trusted resources.
Something we have also seen in the COVID-19 pandemic is an absolute deluge of preprints, and I think Eileen mentioned it as well in her talk. These studies that have not yet been peer reviewed. We're also seeing announcements by press release. We've seen lots of very positive vaccine announcements, but press release, we don't know the data behind it yet. What are your thoughts on that kind of rush to get information out there?
Sure. Well, I think preprints are very positive. I have lots of good things to say about them, particularly for early career researchers. It allows them sort of to get their research out, to sort of put their foot in the sand as to their marking a point. And many funders, such as the National Institutes of Health, promote the use of preprints. I think in the media, and obviously in some areas of research and science, there's a lot of fuss about, usually in the media, they report this article has been peer reviewed, implying that it has passed some sort of screen. what I like to just remind people is that the peer review is great. Everybody loves it. There's simply no evidence that it works. And there are a number of systematic reviews that indicate that. So I think we should be very careful about, our belief in something, an intervention that does not appear to work.
Fair enough. So I think that the message is caveat emptor, I suppose, when you're dealing with these early publications. We did have a question about the fact that sometimes patient data is either not available, or it has to be destroyed after a certain number of years. I mean, you did mention, I think, in your talk that patients are generally very happy for their data to be used for research. But is that a sticking point for researchers, that issue of data retention?
I don't think so. There's a number of repositories where this data can be kept. I don't see it as an issue. Generally speaking, of course, there is some data that can't be shared due to legal reasons and other such reasons. But I think we shouldn't get caught up on that. What we should move forward to realizing is that the bulk of data can be shared. And when I say data sharing, I'm not simply talking about the data alone, because that in and of itself is quite useless. I also mean the analytical code to manipulate the data. You need to share that, and you need to share materials. Perhaps somebody has used a Beck depression inventory instrument to assess depression. Those instruments need to be made available for reuse.
That's fair enough, absolutely. We also had a question in about the cost of publication sometimes being prohibitive for people maybe who don't have the level of funding that would be needed. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the cost of publishing in journals is very crazy. And I think Plan S may offer some hope. And yet I saw this week that Springer Nature, all of the nature journals, if I understood correctly, are going to allow immediate open access of publications, but they will charge £9,000. Who can afford £9,000? Very few people. So I think it is particularly difficult, and I think it's even more difficult for researchers in LMIC, and it's a difficult hurdle to overcome. It's definitely a barrier. In this respect, preprints are quite useful because they don't require a cost in November 2020. Who knows what the future will hold? So I think that's another advantage of preprints. It sort of allows the work to be out there. And I want to emphasize, for those who are interested, it's not peer reviewed. Maybe some people value peer review very highly.
I have seen a lot of talk on social media about that fee of £9,000. It's steep, definitely steep. Maura, maybe I could move on to you and just ask you a little bit more about that, building that culture of research integrity. I suppose when you think of research integrity, most people probably think what they do in research has integrity built into it. But I mean, is there a case where people can be, accidentally doing things they shouldn't do? I guess I'm asking, is all research misconduct deliberate?
No, absolutely not. I mean, there is a huge spectrum of deliberate misconduct, let's say, down the far end where you're talking about people fabricating, falsifying, plagiarizing, right down to just sloppy science at the other end. So, and most of it resides at the sloppy science end, where people are not being deliberate, but I think this is where training becomes really important. So, Lex Bolter and colleagues for the, I think it was the 5th World Congress in Amsterdam, did some ranking of the things that people were doing and trying to kind of identify some of those really poor practices. And a lot of them are around simply people not understanding the right design, the right statistical methodologies or analysis that they should be using, and who are just poorly mentored, poorly trained, or not trained at all, in fact. So I think you can't point the finger at somebody and, you know, a younger researcher, or even sometimes an older researcher, and say, you know, bad boy, you shouldn't be doing that, without saying, here's the way you should be doing it, rather than just simply, you know. So I think we have to really focus on the training side of the house, you know, to
and I was interested to hear Anita, you know, pointing out as well that established researchers who've been doing this for years should also be in on the training for that very reason, in that they have kind of accidentally built poor practices into how they do things. I was also encouraged to hear how much of an impact the local culture can have, you know, the people have the agency to change themselves. But we did have a question in about how the advice that you'd give to a much larger organization, say somewhere like the HSE with 100,000 employees, about sort of improving the quality of research culture. What would your advice there be?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, everything starts with the individual, really. So, you know, how people approach their own research is obviously going to be the key thing. And, you know, supportive policies, and Daniel Finelli has shown this very clearly, that if somebody feels that the policies and the processes and the governance within their organisation, regardless how big it is, even in the HSE, which, as you say, has a huge number of employees, that if there are good policies and processes in place to support what they're trying to do at a more local level, that has a huge impact. But at the end of the day, people, the influences that people see directly around them are just as important, if not more so. So it has to come from both the top and the bottom at the same time. I don't know if Anita wants to add to that, because she's been struggling with this as well.
Anita, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think Maura is absolutely correct. You know, altering the culture in which research is undertaken requires inputs at the top. You need very clear policies, very clear expectations, very clear statement in terms of what is acceptable in terms of a research culture for an environment. But then it's how that is lived out in the day-to-day experience locally, which really makes a difference. Okay, so for me, the key area here is that everybody needs to understand what their role is in supporting people to actually do things appropriately. And that's not a trivial situation. This isn't about a single message. It's about multiple messages with everybody understanding the role that they play and reinforcing that messaging and making sure there's a consistency in that messaging so that it's embedded and people live it on a day-to-day basis.
And in terms, Anita, I suppose, of getting a common language between, you know, if you're talking about, you know, research organizations like universities or institutes of technology, you're talking about researchers themselves, you're talking about funders, you're talking about industry, you know, so sometimes they can speak slightly different languages. How do you find that kind of common ground, or you know, do we need more regular fora for doing that, because so that everybody has the language to talk across those groups?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, right? The key issue here is an understanding. A research ecosystem is like a living organism, right? Each part in that system plays an absolutely critical part. And without them, the whole organism falls apart. So it's really important, the people who undertake research, you know, the universities, the institutes of technology, the research teams within that, you know, the senior researchers and the junior researchers, also the senior management within the research organization, and the funders. Each one of those players plays a critically important part in terms of creating the culture in which our research is undertaken. And it's essential that each one understands the pressures that are on each of the other parts and understands how their intervention impacts on the other players, okay? And in that, the use of language and the use of similar language for the same issues, you know, not coming in and saying the same issue but in a totally different way is really important. So the steps to achieve that is, first of all, ensuring that there's enough space for each of these different players to talk about these issues, to understand the pressures that are underway in each of the issues, and to understand the language which is used, so that therefore, when they're articulating their own view in that language, they're doing it in an understanding of how that plays out in the full ecosystem. And I'll just give you a very good example. For any individual research team, they're typically interacting with a number of different funding agencies. If each of those funding agencies have the same statements, the same approach in terms of research integrity and training and expectation, that has a really powerful effect in terms of embedding with the research team what they need to do. But if they deal with 3 or 4 different funding agencies who say essentially the same thing but in a different language, it doesn't have the same impact whatsoever. So it's really important to get that consistency of approach so that people genuinely do take the important messaging and they embed it internally. I think in particular the push-pull relationship between the RPOs or the universities or the research organizations in terms of encouraging their researchers to become trained in this area, but also to embed these in their practices. That's like a push, okay? And then on the other side, you have the pull of the funders. So the funders say, okay, if you're part of our funding system, this is what we require. And the two of those need to be absolutely lined up for the maximum output. But we have found that, if we time our messaging to match with a funder sending a similar message, suddenly you find people embedding in this. I think it's really important to remember the amount of communication and the amount of requirements that are coming down on a PI on a day-to-day basis. The compliance culture means that there's this deluge of expectations coming on them, and it's very hard for the PIs to actually distinguish what I would call is really important, like research integrity, from the noise, okay? So as organizations, we have a responsibility to actually help them to make that clear and to ensure that all of the messaging aligns so that people understand their role in that messaging. And I think one of the key elements we need to do as research performing organizations is to ensure that our senior researchers actually have time to sit with their early career researchers, sit with their PhD students and postdocs, look at the original raw data, not a filtered version of it. That's something that somebody's worked on, but the original raw data, and that overcomes this subconscious tendency to screen out data because it doesn't fit with the story. It's rarely done in a deliberate sense, but when I walk into an office, if you walk into my office at 6 or 7 o'clock some night, you'll see me there with a PhD student with Spectra on the desk. We're looking at the original data, and I think we need to get back to that culture of valuing that PIs spend that time with their researchers, that's a key part of the research process. They don't just get sent a preprint of a paper following several reviews. And all of the parts in the system need to work together to create that. The Research Integrity Forum is a really important part of one place where we have that dialogue, but we need to create more of those spaces and we need to talk about this more openly.
Absolutely. And I know you mentioned their time pressure, researchers and particularly, I suppose, researchers who are starting off are also possibly under financial pressure as well. So let's not forget that. Maura, maybe I could just very quickly ask you, we did have a question about measuring the impact of this kind of training to improve research culture. Is there any evidence that this kind of training and focus on research integrity has an impact?
Well, now, David might be a better person to answer this. I don't think there is a huge amount of evidence. I know that there is some research being done. I mean, in Lex Bulcher's group, and there is research being done around the world. I haven't seen fantastically strong evidence, but it's early days yet. And I think that the idea of research integrity in particular is really only starting to get traction now. But David, I think you might be able to throw tuppence worth in there as well.
Do, David?
Thank you very much. And there is some research on this, and it is in general quite positive. But there are two sort of confounding problems. One is that funders in general don't fund this type of research that we call meta research or research on research. And so without a funding stream, we can't do quite sophisticated studies. So I forget the name of one of the speakers today mentioned badges. So badges have been shown to be quite successful. The problem is that these studies that have been done, and I'm not faulting the researchers, they're pre-post. What we really want to think about is randomized trials. And what we need to be able to do is actually to go to funders and sort of say, will you fund this stream of research? So I'll just give you a sort of a sad situation in Canada. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, they have at least $1 billion a year. And I asked them to put in my areas of expertise. One of them is meta research. Well, I got a phone call saying, oh, we can't do that. So, funders need to be able to get with the times and fund this type of research, which is very, very important.
That's a good call to action. Mark, maybe if I could move on to you. Thank you for a wonderful keynote. I have to say, as a journalist, I was absolutely glued to it. Maybe if I could ask you to clarify the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. And by the time it gets to a consumer, does it make a difference between the three?
Yeah, and it's a great question, which has befuddled even the people who know a lot about this topic. In fact, sometimes it's the people who know most get most confused. I break it down like this. And first of all, and I think Eileen touched upon this, is misinformation is just wrong things on the internet, right? And people can spread them for all kinds of reasons. Some of them can be just what we used to call urban myths, right? Remember, just around the time of the opening of the lockdown, or the closing of the lockdown, we saw, dolphins swimming in canals in Venice, right? Misinformation. It was wrong. It wasn't inspired by any animus on anyone's part, but it was spread. So that's one aspect of it. Misinformation can also be people with a financial motive to promote, let's say, a false cure for COVID. They're selling something, snake oil in many cases, but generally there might be a commercial reason for that. Where disinformation, we need to call that out specifically, are organized campaigns, generally by political actors. They don't have to be a state or a government. It can be political parties like the far right, for example, in the United States or in Germany, trying to promote real world outcomes, for example, protests against the lockdown. And that's where we really need to be hyper vigilant, because these people have realized that there's kind of, to use the wartime metaphor we used to use, if we reject that, we might think about these people as the people who just want to promote an erosion of trust and an erosion of public health of our conversations. The final part, and this is really important, fake news is a word that we no longer use because it was hijacked by Donald Trump and people like him. These are people who never liked free speech. They don't like a free press. And what they've used is fake news to attack freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And we're now starting to see fake news laws in places like Singapore being used to essentially fight back against freedom of the press. So that's why we have jettisoned that phrase and we don't use it anymore. The reason all this is important is because of real world impact. And I think that's how we have to judge, how important we should attach to these different labels. I would argue disinformation is a way for these groups to try and influence dangerous outcomes. Therefore, disinformation is where we should be hyper vigilant. But again, even in those circumstances, the super spreaders tend to be people who don't know they're being deceived or being manipulated, or who tend to feel that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things here is, while very intelligent people can often spread this disinformation unknowingly, because of one of the most important of the heuristics, confirmation bias. It feels true to me. It aligns with my identity online. And I think that's one of the most powerful reasons that we have to be so vigilant about that specific type of false information, disinformation.
Absolutely. And it is hard you have to consciously remind yourself to be vigilant. I know as a journalist, I'm constantly asking myself, why am I seeing this now? And if I can answer that question and in all good faith, kind of know that there's good intent behind it, then, proceed. But if there's any question, not. It struck me as well, I suppose, David was talking about how universities value the quantity of publications, social media value the emotions that we have. I suppose, from the perspective of health researchers and what you're learning from Kinsen about, through the algorithm where you're looking at all the social media, is there any advice that you can give, any more advice that you can give to health researchers about how to process information, how to communicate information, Mark?
Yeah, I think, it's what is that Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where, people who are expert in the field sometimes feel like imposters. And then people who know nothing can come across as feeling so authentic and powerful. And that's why in many ways we're seeing that played out in writ large, I think, in this case. So my advice would be to take a look at some of the studies that have been done, particularly in the UK since the beginning of the coronavirus look at what's happened. We had, first of all, a rush to expertise of all kinds. So people, as soon as their lives were threatened, their families were under threat, they went straight to the media outlets they trusted most, like the BBC. They put a huge amount of stock in what officials said, and to an extent also governments. Now that has declined quite dramatically in recent months, as they've seen conflicts in evidence, as they've seen, for example, they were told at the beginning not to wear masks, then they were told to wear masks. So there's been an evolution on the basis of evidence that's emerging. And that is, I think, eroding trust. So what we're seeing now is, if you are a researcher and an expert, then I would not be relying upon your message being articulated by officials that turn up on the news or by the politicians. I will be looking for authenticity about your expertise. And what I mean by that is that people do gravitate toward people in their communities that have an authentic connection and a real sense of having your back. And in every study I've ever seen about trust, this notion of benevolence is critical. They will gravitate toward people, yes, who have authority, but more importantly, they will gravitate toward people they feel have their backs. And to that extent, that's why I think in the public health messaging around public behavior around coronas, it's most effective when you feel you're protecting others. And to that extent, I think I would be definitely looking at the way in which you can connect with key influencers online. So people, for example, that might be involved in fitness or in health and wellness generally. As I say, the enemies of public information have been hijacking those communities. I would love to see a coordinated effort to try and reach out to people in communities online, particularly, that are animated by a trust that comes from taking care of people, being the first one in your friends and your family to check something in a nice way and say, hey, by the way, I know you meant really well here. Did you know that that was based on a mistaken report? So, you know, the more that we can see all of you in conversations and forums around health and activity, the better. And the more that you individually can, you know, make your friends and family vectors of truth. I think that could be the greatest contribution that we could all make. And finally, I think Eileen has given very specifics, but this idea of pre-bunking. Think yourselves about the search terms come March or February or January even, when the vaccines come out. Think of what arcane medical terminology everybody's going to know about when this is all being debated, and try and get out there and fill those data voids, prepare the truth sandwiches. Here's what we know about this. This is wrong. Again, here's what we know is true about this. So prep yourselves. You are going to be vital in the months to come. And it will be by persuading individuals to stop, check the gut emotion that they have before they share something, and remember what you said. That will be, I think, the litmus test of your success as influencers yourselves.
Oh, that's excellent advice. To be honest, Mark, I'm getting to the age where I have to ask my kids who the influencers are these days, but we can all, I suppose, be micro-influencers in our own right. Just a very quick question. People were asking, why did you sell to News Corp? Why did you sell?
When I look back in 2013 when we sold the company, we could not generate a sustainable business going out there and trying to help news organizations find out what was true or not. We just couldn't. So we had to sell the business. And it looks back now when we have like 300 fact-checking organizations and an awful lot of money in this area. It just wasn't the same back in 2013. And then we sold it to News Corporation back at a time when, you know, we had a complete assurances about what we were doing. And today, Storyful is now, I think, 200 people across the world. But little did we know the role that things like Fox News would play in the 2016 election and now as well. So yeah, looking back, as I said in my presentation, hindsight is so clear. And there's so much I've learned that's changed my mind about the role of journalism and the role of corporations. And so in many ways with Kinsen, we have a chance to learn from the mistakes that many of us have made over the past 7-8 years. And thinking back and where we were in 2013, we were so naive about what was to come. But we've all learned that lesson. And none of us now at this stage can claim ignorance of the extent of this problem and the individual responsibilities now we all have as journalists and researchers, and also I would say politicians.
But that's one of the risks, I suppose, of being an early pioneer. You were someone who pushed those boundaries very, very early and saw the potential benefits. But as you say, you have to learn the hard lessons as well. And finally, what does the name Kinsen mean? Or where does it come from?
It was really, it's a made up name. People think it's a Japanese terminology we picked up. It just is this concept of kin, collaboration, family, that sense of trust you get from being in a conversation where someone's saying to you that you know benefits you. And Zen, that sense of reaching a point in this mad world of social media empowered conversations where you can stop for a minute and go, yeah, that is true. So it's just a combination of two emotions we hope people will increasingly feel in the years ahead as we try and reclaim that democratic and collaborative promise of the internet that was lost over the past 7 or 8 years.
Very good. Here's hoping. Here's hoping. Absolutely. Eileen, thank you so much for your talk. I was absolutely glued to it. I'm going to show this to my kids, and I think we should all have those checklists in our heads and understand the context of what we are reading and sharing on social media. I suppose one of the questions we had was about uncertainty and communicating uncertainty, because obviously uncertainty is at the heart of research. You wouldn't do research about something you knew the answer to. So, and those answers evolve over time as well. In fact, when I was last year, I was at the World Conference of Science Journalists in Lausanne, and one of the topics that kept coming up in conversations and discussions on stage was the need to communicate the process of science. That science isn't just about a breakthrough. The scientist just like squirrels away in the lab for a while, and then boom, 3 years later comes out and has the answer. That there's a process going there. There's an iteration and uncertainty. But I suppose, what would your advice be to people, about dealing with that uncertainty, particularly in a very fast-moving pandemic?
Yeah, well, I think the uncertainty problem really is, communication alone isn't going to solve that. And when we think of scientific education, the way people are taught about science in school, it tends to be very much solved problems rather than explaining to people what the process is and normalizing uncertainty. And it also relates to the way science tends to be covered in the news. So this relationship between research studies and then news media coverage. So on the one hand, there's this problem with the vast majority of journalists don't have scientific backgrounds. Their background is in humanities. So there's a kind of a cultural gulf there between how science works. But also, coming back to some of the things David was pointing out earlier, universities are businesses and they want to promote their good research. So a lot of the problems come from the PR that's written around those studies in the first place before it even gets to the journalist. And the process and the uncertainty gets written out of that. So I think there's a huge problem there. And then trying to come along with COVID when suddenly everyone is really, really interested in scientific research, and to say, oh, by the way, there's a lot of uncertainty, that's normal. I think we have to give people a bit of credit there for why they're asking those questions.
Of course, absolutely. Uncertainty is never easy to deal with, is it? I suppose we did have a question as well, a very popular question about how can scientists work with media to ensure that their results are reported sort of in an accurate and non-hyped up way. Have you any advice there?
Well, yeah, exactly. I think having more involvement in that press release process is a key one, and that in my area of research, it's not medical or hard sciences or anything, but I think all researchers have to take some responsibility for what goes into the press releases about their research. It's not enough to just blame journalists, and many people have already pointed out the failings of journalists in reporting science, but it can't all just be blamed on them. I thought it was interesting recently the coverage of the COVID vaccine and this confusion between the in-news coverage of research that was scientific research versus press releases from the drug companies, and that the distinction between the two often wasn't clear. And it's that type of stuff, I think, as well, that is really important, that people can tell the difference between the two, because we know from the types of disinformation that are being mobilized around the vaccine are very focused on this idea of ulterior motives. Who's going to benefit from this? That there are major economic benefits, and that's why we shouldn't trust it. So there needs to be a lot of transparency built into the research and then the reporting on it.
And that brings me neatly to another very popular question: is what would your advice be for agencies who are looking to try and encourage uptake of this vaccine? Because obviously, a vaccine's great, but vaccination is what saves lives. So how do we get people to kind of trust the process of vaccination and to engage with vaccination programs?
Well, it has to be addressing people's safety concerns. So we know that the main reason people are hesitant towards a range of vaccines, particularly in Europe, but in English-speaking discussions around vaccines, it tends to be these issues of safety. And there was a massive setback in Ireland with the controversy surrounding the HPV vaccine, and they all centred on safety. And I think it comes in the news clip that Mark showed as well, these very emotive kind of stories of something dramatic that has happened where vaccines haven't worked. They tend to focus a lot on children, or something terrible has happened to a child. And these are emotive stories. And scientists and health researchers are not usually used to using this language of emotion while they're working with facts and evidence and process. So trying to find ways to present the scientific consensus around vaccines and reinforce the safety without getting dragged into this tit for tat about individual cases, and really having empathy for the fact that it is perfectly rational to be concerned about your family or your children when you hear a scary story. And maybe you end up sharing that scary story. You're not, we'd be better if you didn't do that, but you can't blame people for these things. We have to have some empathy for the situation they find themselves in.
Absolutely. Well, we could talk about this all evening, but I'm afraid we have to wrap up. We have run out of time. Apologies if I didn't get to your question. There was huge interest in this session, but I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, to David, to Maura, to Anita, to Mark, and to Eileen, and also to Maura for doing such a wonderful job as MC. And I shall hand back to her now. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Claire. I agree with you. That discussion could have gone on all evening. Actually, there was just so much to cover, and I think it just reflects the really great interest in the subject and indeed the quality of the contributions from all of our speakers this afternoon. So well done to everybody. It was really fascinating. We are approaching now the end of the conference, and of course it's customary at this point for someone to step in and attempt to sum it all up. There's always a masochist. And I'm delighted that Dr. Sandra Galvin from the HRB CMRN has offered to step in and take on the task. She is our resident masochist for the conference. But there were so many angles covered and so many interesting points. It's going to be a tough job to put it together, but I'm sure she's going to do a fantastic job. So go for it, Sandra. I've great faith in you.
Thank you so much, Mairead, and just well done to yourself for hosting, and to all of the speakers on a truly exceptional event. I think it's fair to say that we have been glued to all three sessions over the last couple of days. And thank you also for asking me to take on this task of recapping on what really was an excellent and a thought-provoking event. I know it's the end of the day and everyone's tired. I'm going to try and do this as concisely as I can, and I know that you'll appreciate there was so much covered. But I've thoroughly enjoyed being a delegate at this event and soaking up the information being shared. So to begin, the conference was warmly opened by our Minister for Health here in Ireland, Stephen Donnelly, who discussed how the current pandemic has highlighted the crucial role and the need for good research, to which he commented that Irish researchers are delivering, but also that we need to tackle the infodemic in our daily lives and really to help us be able to decipher fact from fiction. We kicked off our first session, which was looking at understanding health misinformation and disinformation, and we met with three truly exceptional speakers. Sir Ian Chalmers took us on a historical, provocative journey, in which he invited us to join him in asking the question, can unaccountable research ethics committees be trusted to help protect patients and the public? And in answering this, he reflected at the huge issue of research waste, which was certainly a theme that was continued throughout the three sessions. We looked at how historically needless patient morbidity and mortality has resulted from the conduct of research within a contextual void, ignoring available evidence and not considering evidence synthesis when approving research. Sir Chalmers really wanted to use this platform to discuss concerns he's held for over 52 years that flawed ethical analyses have underpinned the need to reduce uncertainties about the effects of treatments. He approached this talk from the perspective of a patient and as a citizen, but informed by his work as a healthcare professional through the years. And he now calls on the next generation of researchers and healthcare professionals to continue this discussion and hopefully make improvements in this area. And while he finished on a note of positive change, providing an action plan in how to make this better, and a lovely symbol of the future in his granddaughter, Millie Chalmers. Sir Chalmers reflected on the excellent work by Dr. Andy Oxman in Norway on a now global initiative called the Informed Health Choices Project, and this nicely led our way into the talk by Professor Declan Devan, who used this resource to show us how to disentangle health claims. What are the warning signs here? And as an informed public, what should we look out for? While we might think that the concept of an infodemic is a new concept, Declan reflected on Jonathan Swift's phrase from the 1700s, falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it. Declan worked with the event's PPI contributors, Anne Daly and Deirdre McLaughlin, focusing on four key concepts which he showed us as a toolkit for breaking down bogus health claims. Our third speaker then asked us to think about what is it about this type of information that makes it successful, or is it actually something in our own cognition? Dr. Gillian Murphy showed us the who, the when, the what and the how of this, and used patches of weeds, causing us all to wake up and look at our ability to slow down and review our gut response to a fact. New terms for me included truthiness and illusory truth, I hope I'm saying that right, and her examples of human behaviour around remembering events or facts from real life, which was really interesting. Since Gillian's talk, national media in Ireland here has picked up on many of the facets, including how we know so little about the downstream impact of fake news and how we need to develop people's cognitive skills for processing information. Our afternoon session focused on assessing the credibility of health claims, and I can safely say there was no mincing of words here. We met with Professor Edzard Ernst, who looked at research into so-called alternative medicine. And he uses this acronym, or SCAM, to describe most of the alternative therapies discussed. In the Q&A, we learned that Professor Ernst started out years ago actually as an advocate for homeopathy, and through the best research methods possible, he discovered by working from the inside how flawed this research area actually is. I personally was shocked to learn that 25% of the UK population uses some aspect of SCAM, and this can be higher in certain patient groups. And he showed us the real detrimental effects that these so-called alternative medicines can have on human health. He explored alternative medicine research more broadly, looking at all aspects, including methodology, funding, expertise, and the motivations behind the research who were looking at this. Laid bare, the underpinning major shortcomings around so-called alternative medicine research was presented, and how alternative medicines are having a free ride, given that they have little to no underpinning evidence about their effects. The afternoon session then brought us a real tour de force, where PPI contributor met GP, or rather, two friends sat down and had an honest chat. Margaret McCartney and Deirdre McLaughlin discussed stakeholder collaboration in finding the truth in conflicting science. It became clear that Deirdre is a true PPI champion who talked about the HRB PPI Ignite initiative and how this group in Galway has acted as a catalyst for her in PPI research, as this ultimately brings a lived experience to the table, including shaping how this conference came into being. I hope she doesn't mind me describing her as a powerhouse of passion and drive for PPI research that was ultimately a most inspiring conversation. Deirdre explained that PPI is simply a conversation, and it can shape the conduct of research for the better, to get more meaningful outcomes. Deirdre and Margaret talked about the inclusivity in research across race, gender, and background. Deirdre's advice to anyone and everyone in the area of misinformation was, be vigilant and think critically. Social media is testing us, and we need to equip ourselves. But as she questions, we take charge of so many aspects of our lives, so why not this? This afternoon, we explored responsibility and integrity in reporting health research with three distinguished speakers. Our colleague, Dr. David Moher from Canada, spoke about promoting trustworthiness in research and asked the question, do we need to modify current perverse incentives and rewards when assessing researchers? David set this scene by outlining the academic criteria for promotion and tenure in the biomedical sciences area, and the fact that publications are seen as a currency for research, and that this could even drive someone to include their publications listing as a QR code in their tombstone is one that will stay with me. This publish or perish attitude to publications can bring with it significant issues in the trustworthiness and integrity of research, including the rise of fake or predatory journals. David spoke about how the COVID-19 research pandemic research wasn't an exception, and how this research also fell foul to these issues, despite initiatives being set up to help combat this. David talked us through the Hong Kong principles, which try to foster research integrity and provide real guidance in this area. And this was only just published this summer. And in his talk, he covered the 5 principles which he outlined for us, which included valuing accurate and transparent reporting of research regardless of the results. And I know that many of us will be keen to read that paper. We then met with another fantastic double act in this conference. Dr. Maura Hiney and Professor Anita Maguire looked at developing a culture of good research practice, looking at both national and international examples. Dr. Hiney outlined that she considers included in the topic of research integrity, seeing it as across all steps in research, from the conception and design right through to dissemination. And this echoed many of the points that Dr. Moher had previously raised. She explored the urgent threats we face when it comes to developing a positive culture, but also the range of EU-funded projects which are tackling this area and the global initiatives being implemented. Anita then explored the Irish perspective, looking at the Research Integrity National Forum in Ireland since 2015. She spoke about the training in this area, for which over 11,000 people have undertaken to date. And important to note that this is researchers from all levels, from both junior researchers right up to principal investigators. Anita also spoke how UCC, where she is based, have taken a proactive approach to embed these principles locally, with an impressive account of how staff and students have come together meaningfully to engage in tackling this. Certainly something I think that all institutions nationally can aspire to. Our penultimate speaker this afternoon was Mark Little, who explored flattening the curve of misinformation and strategies for success in a world of alternative facts. Mark explored the current infodemic and also the campaigns of deception that feed into this, and how we need to flatten the other curve. He reflected on the way we share information 30 years ago in his early days of RTE, our national broadcaster here in Ireland. Protests on the streets of Tehran were a light bulb moment for him, as he saw how the centre of the story was moving to the younger generation, or rather anyone with a phone. And this led him to start Storyful, the first social media news agency. Now Mark is leading Kinsen, which supports editors with machine learning and AI against the second wave of disinformation. He describes the spread of disinformation in the same language used in the pandemic, such as in super spreader events where social media influencers share or retweet disinformation. And I found this a really impactful way to signal the seriousness of the infodemic. He ended on, be first, be clear and be kind. And like all of our speakers had said, seek reliable, evidence-based information before you decide. Our last speaker this evening was Dr. Eileen Culloty, looking at understanding and countering healthcare disinformation. Eileen started off with a really impressive account of the projects that she has worked in DCU, directly working to counter healthcare information. She talked about scientific distortions in the media, the energy put into correcting this, and how COVID-19 research has put all of this into overdrive. Eileen provided an overview of the factors as to why some people are more susceptible to disinformation, which was also echoed in Dr. Murphy's earlier talk, in particular around this aspect of repeated exposure to false claims. She highlighted another less well-researched area in that we know so little about the motivations for why people share disinformation, but alluded to some of the reasons for this, including that some feel it's a civic duty playing a role here. Like all speakers, Eileen included practical, positive, evidence-based approaches and responses, which we can all use in countering this infodemic. So I want to thank you for those that have hung around to hear that synopsis. I'm really pleased to have taken part in this conference, and thank you all for listening. I want to once again sincerely thank the speakers for such an engaging and interesting conference. I could have spoken for a lot longer, as you may have gathered. But for now, I'm delighted to hand back to the studio and to Mairead to close. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandra. That was an absolute tour de force, so well done. Now, we've reached the end of what was a really enjoyable 2 days. And as you can imagine, putting together an online show like this is no mean feat. I have a lot of people to acknowledge. I'm not going to name everyone. I couldn't name everyone, but I am going to single out a few people. So first of all, I mentioned at the start that this conference was the HRB's first collaborative national conference. And I would like to thank our partners in the conference, HRB TMRN, Evidence Synthesis Ireland and Cochrane Ireland, for their unwavering support throughout. I want to thank the Conference Programme Committee from the HRB and from those partner organisations who demonstrated great flexibility when we had to transition from an in-person event, because that's the way it was originally planned, to an online event. And our thanks especially to the co-chairs of the conference organising committee, that's Gillian Markey and Sandra Galvin. And in particular, I would like to single out Deirdre McLaughlin and Anne Daly, who represented the public and patient voice on the committee. There's absolutely no doubt that this event was much better as a result of their honest feedback, constructive criticism, and their very good ideas. I particularly want to thank the Minister for sending us the opening address, and also all the speakers. It's a challenge and a time commitment at any time if you have to speak at a conference. When you have to provide a presentation a week in advance and then attend rehearsals, it's an additional demand. So my thanks to you for making this such an interesting and topical event. Then, of course, we had 3 excellent moderators throughout, Avril Kennan, Teresa Maguire and Claire O Connell, and also the background Q&A support team, and they were Lydia O'Sullivan and Olivia Cagney in particular. It's not easy to coordinate this kind of a live event, and they all did it with great aplomb. I want to thank those who drove the promotion of the event and the live tweeting throughout. Lisa Murphy, Martha Connolly, Anna Dunn, Nikita Burke, Marina Zaki and Ciara Kennan in particular. Kudos to all of you. It's one of the reasons we had almost 2,000 registrations across our 3 sessions. I would like to thank conference partners and Staunton Media for their great support and for making sure that the transition to online was seamless. We won't be so nervous in future of taking this approach again, and that's very much down to your calm guidance and your support throughout. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us. You don't have an event at all without an audience, obviously. The conference is going to remain live for a few more days, so anyone who registered can watch the different presentations, and it will then move to the HRB YouTube page where you will also be able to watch it. And I really would encourage you to share this content with others so that we can increase awareness and build trust in health research. So with that, it's goodbye from all of us here in the HRB. Stay safe.